For decades, the Bermuda Triangle has swallowed ships and aircraft without warning, leaving behind only fleeting signals, scattered logs, and the briefest SOS calls that vanished into the Atlantic.
Can you describe the aircraft? As it's flying past, it's a long shape. Cannot identify it. It has such speed. It's hovering and it's not an aircraft.
From the open expanse of the ocean to the shifting currents near the Florida coast, these final transmissions hint at sudden disorientation, inexplicable navigational errors, and phenomena that resist explanation, leaving only silence in their wake. Across these waters, you will follow the last known messages of cargo vessels drifting into nowhere, private aircraft reporting confused coordinates, and crews whose voices were the final trace of life over endless blue. As each signal crackles over the waves, you will sense the tension, the subtle distortions of the sea and sky, and the eerie uncertainty that surrounds every disappearance. Flight 19 and the Vanishing Training Squadron. On the afternoon of December 5th, 1945, a routine training exercise departed from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale in Florida under clear winter skies. The mission, designated Flight 19, consisted of 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers conducting navigation problem number 1 over the Atlantic. Within hours, the squadron's increasingly disoriented radio transmissions would become one of the most cited final SOS calls associated with the region, later known as the Bermuda Triangle. What began as a standard overwater drill evolved into a sequence of confused position reports, fading signals, and unresolved silence that has endured for decades. Shortly after 2:10 p.m, the aircraft lifted off in succession, each carrying a crew of 2 or 3 men. The flight leader was Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, a 28-year-old experienced naval aviator who had recently transferred to Fort Lauderdale. The exercise plan was simple: fly east from the Florida coast for a set distance, conduct bombing practice over the Hens and Chicken Shoals near the Bahamas, then turn north and finally southwest to return to base. Weather reports described moderate seas and scattered showers, but visibility was considered acceptable for training, and no extraordinary atmospheric disturbances were recorded along their planned route. By mid-afternoon, the bombers had completed their bombing runs, and the formation turned north as scheduled. At approximately 3:40 p.m, however, an instructor at Fort Lauderdale overheard a troubling transmission. Taylor reported that both of his compasses were malfunctioning and that he was unsure of his position. According to official Navy transcripts, he stated, "I am sure I'm in the Florida Keys, but I do not know how far down." The remark revealed a fundamental navigational error, as the planned route should have placed the squadron east of Florida over open Atlantic waters, not south near the Keys. As the minutes passed, other pilots in the formation began to question the assessment. One was heard saying, "If we would just fly west, we would get home." The suggestion reflected a basic principle of their training. Flying west from almost any point east of Florida would eventually lead to the mainland. Yet Taylor hesitated. Believing he was over the Gulf of Mexico rather than the Atlantic, he reportedly ordered the flight to continue northeast, attempting to locate land that matched his expectations. The squadron, bound by protocol and hierarchy, followed the leader's instructions despite their growing uncertainty. Communication between Flight 19 and the control tower grew fragmented as distance increased. Radio operators at Fort Lauderdale attempted to triangulate the signals, but reception fluctuated across frequencies. Weather conditions deteriorated gradually, with sunset approaching and winds intensifying over the Atlantic. At 4:25 p.m, Taylor transmitted that they were uncertain of their heading and that the ocean does not look as it should. The phrase suggested unfamiliar sea coloration or wave patterns, though such perceptions could also result from fading daylight, shifting cloud cover, and the distortion of light across open water late in the day. Fuel concerns soon became unavoidable. The TBM Avengers carried enough fuel for roughly 5 hours of flight under normal conditions, leaving a narrowing margin for error as their path grew uncertain. Around 5 p.m, Taylor's voice conveyed rising urgency. He reported that they were not sure where we are and that everything is wrong. The control tower instructed the squadron to turn due west, a direction that would almost certainly lead to Florida, but radio interference complicated the exchange. Some transmissions were heard clearly, others dissolved into static, leaving fragments of conversation without context. Approaching 6 p.m, the final coherent messages indicated that the aircraft were flying in close formation, attempting to conserve fuel and maintain visual contact as daylight disappeared. Taylor was heard saying that when the first plane's fuel dropped below 10 gallons, they would all ditch together. Witnesses later recalled fragments such as, "We'll have to ditch unless landfall," though the exact phrasing varied among transcripts and recollections recorded afterward. The intention to land on the open sea underscored the severity of their predicament, as nightfall would make coordinated ditching exceptionally hazardous even under calm conditions. After approximately 7 p.m, contact with Flight 19 weakened dramatically. One operator briefly picked up a transmission believed to be Taylor's voice stating, "It looks like we're entering white water," but the source and meaning of the phrase remain debated among historians and aviation researchers. Some suggest it may have referred to breaking waves in heavy seas. Others argue that misheard static may have distorted the message over long-range frequencies. Shortly thereafter, the radio signals faded entirely. No confirmed distress call beyond these fragmented exchanges was ever recorded in official logs. The Navy initiated an immediate search effort that extended across hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean and coastline. Ironically, a Martin PBM Mariner flying boat dispatched from Naval Air Station Banana River to search for Flight 19 also vanished that same evening with 13 crew members aboard. A tanker later reported seeing an explosion and a spreading oil slick, suggesting the Mariner may have suffered a catastrophic in-flight detonation, a known hazard for that aircraft type. Yet the disappearance of the rescue plane compounded the sense of inexplicable loss surrounding the original squadron. In the days that followed, ships and aircraft combed the Atlantic east of Florida and around the Bahamas in widening arcs. The operation became one of the largest peacetime searches conducted by the US. Navy up to that point, involving carriers, patrol planes, and numerous smaller vessels. Despite extensive efforts and coordinated search grids, no confirmed wreckage from Flight 19 was ever recovered. Occasional debris discovered in subsequent years could not be conclusively linked to the missing Avengers. The absence of physical evidence left investigators reliant on radio transcripts, navigational charts, and weather data to reconstruct the final hours. A Navy Board of Investigation initially concluded that the cause of the disappearance was unknown, reflecting the absence of tangible proof. Later revisions suggested that Taylor's navigational confusion likely led the squadron far out to sea, where fuel exhaustion forced them to ditch in rough and darkening conditions. The Atlantic east of Florida contains powerful currents, including the Gulf Stream, capable of dispersing wreckage rapidly across vast distances and pulling debris away from search zones within hours. Even so, the complete lack of identifiable aircraft components has remained a point of fascination and debate. Over time, Flight 19 became central to narratives surrounding the so-called Bermuda Triangle, a term popularized in the 1960s through magazine articles and later books. Writers and researchers pointed to the final transmissions as evidence of strange compass behavior and spatial disorientation within a loosely defined geographic region bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. Skeptics countered that human error, adverse weather, and navigational misjudgment provided sufficient explanation without invoking anomalies. The original transcripts, however, reveal something quieter than legend, a gradual unravelling of certainty as instruments, perception, and environment conflicted under pressure. What endures most vividly is the sound of a leader struggling to reconcile his instruments with the horizon, guiding 4 obedient aircraft deeper into gathering darkness, while shore stations strained to interpret fading signals. The last documented radio exchanges do not contain theatrical panic. Instead, they reflect confusion, discipline, and adherence to procedure, even as fuel reserves dwindled and options narrowed. Somewhere beyond the range of shore-based receivers, 5 Avengers likely descended toward a darkened sea, their final position unrecorded and their distress unheard beyond fading static. No confirmed trace of Flight 19 has ever been found. The PBM Mariner that answered the call. Even as confusion deepened over the Atlantic on December 5, 1945, a Martin PBM-5 Mariner prepared to lift off from Naval Air Station Banana River in response to the missing Flight 19. The training squadron's increasingly uncertain transmissions had already alarmed naval authorities, and daylight was fading when orders were given to launch a long-range search aircraft. What followed would become another unresolved disappearance associated with the waters later labelled the Bermuda Triangle. The Mariner transmitted routine departure acknowledgements, taxied into position, and lifted into the evening sky, beginning a mission meant to locate 5 lost planes that had failed to return. Massive and deliberate in its movements, the PBM Mariner was a twin-engine patrol bomber designed for maritime reconnaissance and rescue operations across vast ocean distances. Built by the Glenn L. Martin Company, the aircraft had served extensively during the Second World War, conducting anti-submarine patrols and convoy protection missions. With a wingspan exceeding 100 feet and the capacity to remain airborne for long durations, it was engineered for endurance rather than fragility. Its fuel tanks were extensive, supplying the range required for wide search grids, yet that same capacity introduced risks that crews understood well. 13 servicemen boarded the aircraft that evening, aware that the search area lay somewhere east of Florida and north of the Bahamas. Their task was not routine training, but an active response to an unfolding emergency involving fellow aviators. Naval procedure required rapid mobilization in such circumstances, and the Mariner was among the few aircraft capable of sustained night search over open water. The crew carried flares and survival equipment intended for potential rescue operations, expecting to locate downed airmen rather than become part of the same mystery. Cleared for takeoff at approximately 7:27 p.m., the Mariner acknowledged instructions from the control tower before heading out over the Atlantic. Radio logs confirm that the departure was uneventful and that no mechanical irregularities were reported during initial climb. Communications protocols required position updates at scheduled intervals, yet within minutes of becoming airborne, something disrupted the mission. There was no recorded distress call, no emergency frequency activation, and no indication of navigational confusion. The aircraft simply ceased transmitting further routine reports. A merchant tanker navigating offshore that evening, the SS Gaines Mills, later reported observing a bright flash in the sky followed by flames spreading across the ocean's surface. Crew members described what appeared to be an aerial explosion and burning fuel drifting atop the water. The sighting occurred within a time frame consistent with the Mariner's departure, though precise coordinates were difficult to verify. The tanker's report prompted immediate attention, as such an explosion would align with a catastrophic mid-air event. Yet no confirmed wreckage was recovered to conclusively match the description. Compounding the mystery, the PBM Mariner carried a fuel configuration that had already earned it an uneasy reputation among aircrews. The aircraft's long-range tanks vented gasoline vapours into spaces where electrical components and static discharge could ignite them under the right conditions. Several crews had privately nicknamed the Mariner the Flying Gas Tank, reflecting the risks inherent in its extended-range design. While structurally sound and designed for endurance, the aircraft required careful management of fuel vapours during flight. Investigators later acknowledged that even a minor spark in a vapour-rich compartment could have produced the sudden flash observed by the tanker. The PBM Mariner carried a reputation among some crews as a flying gas tank, a reflection of concerns about fuel vapour accumulation within its large internal tanks. Investigations into prior incidents had documented the potential for flammable vapours to ignite under certain conditions, particularly if ventilation systems malfunctioned. Although many Mariners operated safely throughout the war, the aircraft's fuel system design required meticulous handling. The possibility of an in-flight explosion caused by vapour ignition became one of the leading explanations for its disappearance. Though without recovered debris, the theory remained circumstantial rather than proven. Search efforts intensified almost immediately after the Mariner failed to report its first scheduled position update. Naval vessels and additional aircraft expanded the search grid that had already been established for Flight 19, now scanning for 6 aircraft instead of 5. The Atlantic east of Florida is influenced by the Gulf Stream, a powerful current capable of dispersing floating debris over considerable distances in a short period. Darkness further complicated observation, as oil slicks and scattered wreckage could easily escape detection amid shifting swells and low visibility. Less frequently discussed is the operational pressure surrounding that December evening. The Navy had already committed aircraft across a widening grid in response to Flight 19's disappearance, stretching coordination between coastal bases and surface vessels. The Mariner's dispatch was urgent but not reckless, reflecting doctrine that search and rescue planes launch quickly while daylight or clear weather still offer advantage. Yet as darkness fell, navigation became more complex and visual confirmation increasingly difficult. The Mariner entered that expanding search pattern not as a missing aircraft but as an active participant in a growing emergency, one whose own fate would remain unknown within hours. Conflicting assessments soon emerged regarding the reported explosion's location relative to the Mariner's expected flight path. The tanker's account suggested a position that may or may not have aligned precisely with the aircraft's projected search corridor. Navigational estimation at sea during nighttime conditions carried inherent uncertainties, and investigators had to reconcile maritime logs with aviation radio records. Without definitive debris fields or identifiable components, the connection between the explosion sighting and the Mariner could not be conclusively established, leaving room for ambiguity within the official narrative. Unlike Flight 19's prolonged series of confused transmissions, the Mariner offered no audible progression toward distress. There were no statements about failing instruments, no fuel concerns relayed over static-filled frequencies, and no final acknowledgement of deteriorating conditions. The absence of a Mayday call suggested that whatever occurred happened suddenly, leaving little or no opportunity for the crew to respond. In aviation investigations, the presence of partial communication often assists reconstruction. Here, silence replaced dialogue, limiting analysis to inference and external observation. Night over the Atlantic creates an environment where perception narrows to instrument readings and faint horizon lines. Cloud cover that evening was scattered, and while no severe storm system dominated the region at the time of departure, shifting weather bands and darkness could obscure visual cues. If an explosion did occur at altitude, fragments would have descended into waters already difficult to survey. The ocean's surface can conceal debris within minutes, especially when currents and wind disperse lighter materials across expanding arcs. Official Navy inquiries ultimately suggested that the Mariner most likely suffered a catastrophic explosion shortly after takeoff. The explanation rested heavily on the tanker's testimony and the aircraft's known fuel vapor vulnerabilities. However, investigators acknowledged the absence of physical confirmation, noting that no positively identified wreckage was ever retrieved from the search zone. The conclusion, while plausible, relied on probability rather than certainty, and the final radio record remained limited to departure acknowledgements without distress. Within a single evening, 2 separate aircraft groups had vanished from the same general region of the Atlantic. The rescue mission intended to clarify one disappearance instead compounded the uncertainty. Naval authorities faced the task of explaining not only navigational confusion among trainee aviators, but also the sudden loss of a long-range patrol bomber equipped for maritime operations. The psychological weight of consecutive disappearances shaped public perception, gradually contributing to a broader mythology surrounding those waters. All that persists in documented archives are routine logs marking takeoff time, the tanker's observation of a distant fireball, and the expanding grid coordinates of an unsuccessful search. The Mariner's crew left no recorded final message, no urgent request for assistance, and no confirmed evidence of a mechanical warning. Whether the aircraft succumbed to internal ignition, structural failure, or another unforeseen factor, its fate remains inferred rather than demonstrated, suspended between probability and unanswered absence. Somewhere between the runway lights of Banana River and the dark horizon beyond the Gulf Stream, the aircraft sent to search for the missing disappeared without ever asking for help. Star Tiger's fading position reports. Evening shadows had begun to stretch across Bermuda as Star Tiger lifted from Kindley Field, bound for Kingston, Jamaica, carrying 25 souls into the Atlantic night. The Avro Tudor 4 had been cleared for routine flight, its crew familiar with long overwater navigation and the standard radio checks that would mark each stage of the journey. Yet, within the first hour, small anomalies began to appear in routine communications, subtle enough to escape immediate notice. These faint, fading position reports would become a haunting record of the aircraft's final hours, a disappearance that remains unresolved and central to the Bermuda Triangle enigma. The Avro Tudor 4 settled into a steady cruise altitude, its engines humming in consistent rhythm, while the crew conducted standard inspections of instruments and navigational equipment. Charts lay open across the navigator's table and dials measured heading, altitude, and engine performance. with the mechanical precision typical of post-war transatlantic operations. Passengers spoke quietly among themselves, unaware that the evening ahead would turn into an enduring mystery. Each routine adjustment by the flight crew kept the aircraft on course, yet the Atlantic's vastness hinted at the fragility of human orientation when distance, darkness, and isolation combined. At 9:15 p.m, the first scheduled position report was transmitted, a faint signal that registered briefly on Bermuda's receiving station before fading into static. The message contained the aircraft's estimated coordinates and altitude, indicating normal progress along the Bermuda-Jamaica route. Radio operators noted that the transmission, while complete, was slightly weaker than expected. Though the crew did not express concern, investigators later emphasized the importance of signal strength in open ocean operations. Small deviations in power, atmospheric conditions, or antenna alignment could make a routine report appear intermittent, creating the earliest hints of the uncertainty that would ultimately envelop Star Tiger. Above the Atlantic, scattered clouds reflected the waning moonlight, offering glimpses of the dark horizon, while meteorological logs recorded only mild turbulence and a gentle offshore breeze. The flight path traversed a stretch of open water where visual reference points were minimal. Crew members relied heavily on instruments to verify headings and course corrections, aware that even minor miscalculations could result in significant positional drift. As the night deepened, the interplay of moonlight, cloud cover, and distant starlight created subtle illusions across the ocean surface, factors that, while not immediately alarming, compounded the challenge of maintaining absolute certainty over hundreds of miles of unbroken sea. By 10:05 p.m, the routine radio exchanges had grown irregular, with intermittent bursts of voice punctuated by static that left operators uncertain of the aircraft's exact location. The scheduled check-in did not produce a clear response, and the position report that did arrive showed a slight variation from expected coordinates. The atmospheric conditions were not severe, yet electrical interference or minor radio calibration issues may have contributed to the faintness of the signal. Each fading transmission left operators piecing together the aircraft's movements with increasing difficulty, and the first questions about navigational discrepancy began to emerge quietly within Bermuda's control tower. Reports received from Star Tiger indicated minor inconsistencies in course estimation, suggesting that the crew might have been correcting for navigational drift over open water. Calculations derived from radio logs placed the aircraft slightly off its projected path, though no pattern of deviation was immediately obvious. Crew members likely adjusted headings based on dead reckoning, compensating for wind speed and the invisible influence of ocean currents. Even small misalignments in longitude or latitude, unnoticed at the moment, would eventually contribute to growing uncertainty about the plane's position. A subtle unravelling recorded only in intermittent signals rather than visible observation. In the cockpit, the pilots cross-referenced compasses, adjusted headings, and consulted flight logs, their disciplined procedures contrasting sharply with the growing uncertainty reflected in their intermittent transmissions. Crew coordination remained professional and methodical, relying on standard protocols for transatlantic flight. Radio silence between checks prompted cautious monitoring rather than panic, and instruments indicated no immediate mechanical irregularities. Yet the combination of darkness, cloud cover, and minor compass deviations compounded the difficulty of confirming location. These conditions would later be cited in investigations as contributing factors to the aircraft's disappearance, though they offered no definitive explanation for why Star Tiger never completed its journey. As the final scheduled radio check passed without reply, Bermuda authorities began mobilizing vessels and communication relays, expanding a search area that already spanned hundreds of miles of open ocean. Naval and civilian stations relayed position grids and coordinated monitoring of radio channels, scanning for any fragment of communication from the Tudor IV. The absence of additional signals heightened concern, particularly because the crew had not indicated fuel shortage, mechanical trouble, or navigational confusion. The procedural response reflected post-war aviation protocols, emphasizing rapid coverage and triangulation to maximize the likelihood of locating an aircraft that might be straying from its expected course. Night deepened over the Atlantic, and the Gulf Stream's currents complicated calculations, while scattered cloud cover and distant lightning flashes made visual triangulation all but impossible. Investigators later noted that even if Star Tiger had descended or altered altitude, the plane could remain invisible to both observers at sea and radar installations of the era. The interplay between atmospheric conditions, oceanic currents, and signal propagation meant that the faint radio transmissions would be the last verifiable trace. The aircraft moved across a vast indifferent expanse, where a small miscalculation could carry it far from its expected trajectory without leaving immediate evidence of deviation. Investigators later combed radio transcripts, ship logs, and meteorological data in painstaking detail, attempting to reconcile intermittent signals with estimated positions along the flight path. Each weak transmission was analysed for timing, signal strength, and coordinates, producing a patchwork reconstruction of the aircraft's movements. Correlations between reported positions and expected flight trajectory were inconsistent, leaving analysts to theorize whether minor navigational drift or unrecorded environmental factors had contributed to the plane's ultimate disappearance. Despite methodical effort, the last hours remained largely inferred, creating the conditions for the enduring mystery. Examination of the Tudor IV's system suggested no immediate mechanical failure, leaving navigators and engineers to consider the subtle interplay of human error, instrumentation, and atmospheric conditions. Maintenance records indicated the aircraft was fully serviceable, and crew training aligned with standard procedures for long overwater flights. Investigators debated whether gradual misalignment, combined with the challenges of night navigation and cloud interference, could have prevented the crew from correcting course. Every potential variable was weighed, yet none yielded a definitive answer, underscoring the perplexing nature of Star Tiger's fading position reports and the silence that followed. The Royal Air Force and subsequent aviation reviews acknowledged multiple plausible scenarios, yet none could be verified, leaving the fading position reports as the only record of Star Tiger's final hours. Speculation ranged from minor navigational errors compounded by darkness to sudden environmental phenomena, yet each remained unproven. The disappearance of an aircraft under otherwise routine circumstances challenged assumptions about transatlantic flight safety and post-war aviation protocols. These reports became a cautionary example of how even competent crews in well-maintained aircraft could be rendered effectively invisible over an ocean that offered no firm landmarks or warnings. In decades of analysis, the case of Star Tiger has become a defining example of how transatlantic flights can simply vanish, even under competent crew management and favourable conditions. Aviation historians cite the sequence of weak, fading signals as a rare documented instance in which every transmitted coordinate was incomplete, leaving investigators with only fragmentary data. The Atlantic night, though not stormy, proved unyielding to traditional search and rescue methods. The narrative of Star Tiger continues to intrigue scholars and lay audiences alike, blending procedural aviation detail with the enduring enigma of unexplained disappearance. The last faint signals of Star Tiger dissolved into the night, leaving only questions that no instrument or log could answer. Star Ariel and the sudden silence. Above the Atlantic on January 30th, 1948, Star Ariel prepared to depart Bermuda, a routine flight that would soon become one of the most perplexing, unsolved final SOS calls associated with the Bermuda Triangle. Scheduled to fly to Kingston, Jamaica, the airliner carried 14 passengers and 7 crew members, its Avro Tudor IV design known for transatlantic reliability. The morning was calm, the early light scattering across the waters, yet the expanse ahead was vast and largely uncharted for commercial aviation. What would unfold over the next hours would become a case study in sudden disappearance, with only routine departure communications hinting at the tragedy to come. The Avro Tudor IV airliner, designed for transatlantic service, carried a crew of 7 and 14 passengers, each relying on the aircraft's advanced navigation instruments to maintain course over open ocean. The Tudor IV was a 4-engine aircraft with an all-metal fuselage, pressurized cabin, and a range sufficient for long-distance flights. Its twin-spar wing design provided stability in moderate turbulence, while its radio equipment, including HF long-range communication and navigational direction finders, was state-of-the-art for the period. Passengers were seated, reading newspapers or glancing over the horizon, unaware that this routine route would be marked by abrupt and mysterious silence. Pre-flight checks were meticulous, with fuel levels verified, radio equipment tested, and instruments calibrated for long-distance operation, all conducted under calm but cloud-streaked morning skies. Pilots logged pressure altimeter readings, tested engine outputs, and confirmed compass alignments before taxiing to the runway. Flight attendants ensured safety equipment was secured and emergency protocols reviewed. Bermuda radio operators recorded the aircraft's departure acknowledgement, noting normal engine sounds and clear position reporting. The attention to routine procedures reflected the importance of transoceanic flights during the post-war period and established a baseline of operational normalcy, making the later disappearance all the more confounding. Shortly after takeoff, Star Ariel transmitted its first routine position report, indicating steady altitude and speed, with clear coordinates logged by Bermuda radio operators. The aircraft climbed over the azure waters, engines steady and instruments responding accurately to navigational inputs. Early atmospheric conditions offered minimal turbulence, and visibility remained sufficient to see the horizon line and the gentle curve of waves below. Radio operators monitored the aircraft's transmissions with casual reassurance. The signals were strong, coherent, and consistent with flight plans. At this stage, nothing suggested impending disaster, reinforcing the assumption that Star Ariel's journey would proceed uneventfully. Though visibility was generally favourable, scattered cloud layers and a light haze across the horizon hinted at atmospheric conditions that could subtly distort perception and instrument readings. Pilots relied on dead reckoning in combination with compass headings, while occasional bursts of high-altitude wind could create minor deviations from the plotted course. Over the Atlantic, even small miscalculations could magnify across hundreds of miles, but early readings suggested no immediate cause for concern. Still, subtle environmental influences, wave patterns reflecting sunlight, faint cloud shadows or sudden wind shifts introduced variables that would remain speculative in the absence of further transmissions. As the next scheduled transmission approached, ground controllers noted an unusual delay. The expected radio check was faint, and static interference appeared intermittently in the receiver logs. Operators attempted repeated calls, each unanswered, leaving only faint bursts of static as confirmation of the aircraft's continued existence. The unusual lapse prompted subtle concern, though it could have resulted from minor interference or routine atmospheric propagation issues. No evidence suggested malfunction, yet the delay marked the first instance when Star Ariel departed from the predictability that had defined its early flight, an early whisper of the mystery that would follow. Cross-checking the flight path with the aircraft's last confirmed position revealed a minor course adjustment, consistent with navigational corrections, yet small deviations can magnify across long stretches of open water. Pilots would typically correct for winds, drift, and minor instrument discrepancies, but these adjustments remained within expected operational tolerances. Ground control logged headings and compared them against the filed flight plan, noting consistency in altitudes and airspeed. Yet, in retrospect, even these slight variations highlighted the vulnerability of transoceanic navigation when reliant on instruments without visual cues and foreshadowed the sudden cessation of all communications that would soon define the Star Ariel case. Then came the sudden silence. The anticipated radio transmission never arrived, leaving controllers with only static and the fading echo of Star Ariel's departure acknowledgements. Panic did not yet set in, but uncertainty spread among Bermuda radio operators who understood that a normally punctual report had been missed. Attempts to re-establish contact through multiple frequencies yielded nothing. The sudden absence of communication, without any preceding indications of trouble, contrasted sharply with other documented Bermuda Triangle disappearances in which confusion or distress had been reported over time. Here, silence itself became the defining factor, creating a void in both the timeline and the understanding of events. Attempts to triangulate the signal yielded inconsistent results, hampered by cloud cover, sea surface reflection, and the vast distance from shore-based radio stations, making precise location impossible. Operators relied on direction-finding equipment to estimate the aircraft's position, but overlapping transmissions, atmospheric interference, and low signal strength obscured accuracy. Charts plotted potential locations with wide margins of error, creating a search area spanning hundreds of square miles. The absence of definitive coordinates transformed a routine monitoring task into an escalating uncertainty, leaving aviation authorities with little more than speculation on where Star Ariel might have vanished. Within hours, search operations commenced, stretching across hundreds of miles, with naval vessels and aircraft combing the Atlantic currents known to disperse debris rapidly over wide areas. The Royal Air Force and Bermuda authorities coordinated patrols, scanning for signs of wreckage or survivors. Oceanic conditions complicated observation. Choppy swells, scattered cloud cover, and fading light hindered detection. Search teams followed projected flight paths while compensating for the Gulf Stream's influence, which could carry debris far from the aircraft's last estimated location. Despite extensive coverage, no tangible evidence emerged, reinforcing the perception of sudden and inexplicable disappearance. Investigators reviewed maintenance records and flight logs, confirming the Tudor 4 had no known mechanical issues, yet the sudden absence of signals suggested an abrupt event rather than gradual technical failure. Routine inspections documented engine performance, fuel integrity, and avionics functionality, all verified within operational norms. Crew experience records confirmed proficiency with both long-distance navigation and instrument-based flying. The aircraft's readiness stood uncontested, making environmental or external factors the most plausible contributors to disappearance. Still, with no debris or recovered instruments, investigators faced the challenge of analysing a total loss without any physical reference points. The disappearance of Star Ariel, like that of Star Tiger before it, fed speculation around the Bermuda Triangle, but the striking difference lay in its instantaneous loss, providing no incremental distress to document or analyse. Whereas Star Tiger had transmitted fading position reports over time, Star Ariel's last logged communication was routine and unremarkable. The contrast amplified the air of mystery surrounding the triangle, illustrating a spectrum of disappearances from gradual confusion to sudden vanishing. Subsequent analyses noted that the rapidity of the loss limited both empirical evidence and potential survivor testimony, leaving only documentation of departure and silence to mark the event. The Atlantic expanse swallowed Star Ariel without warning, leaving only the faintest traces of human presence in its wake, and the sea kept its secrets locked beneath unbroken waves. Despite thorough searches and repeated overflights, no confirmed wreckage or bodies were ever recovered. The ocean currents and depth, combined with vast search areas, made it plausible that any remnants would have been scattered or submerged beyond detection. The combination of sudden silence, lack of debris, and uninterrupted flight path logging left authorities and historians with an unresolved narrative, one defined by absence rather than recorded distress. Star Ariel disappeared from human perception as abruptly as it had taken flight, leaving an enduring void where its presence should have been. The DC-3NC 16002's final coordinates. Unfolding quietly within routine air traffic, the DC-3NC 16002 issued its first position report, seemingly ordinary yet destined to become its final recorded coordinates over the Atlantic. The aircraft, operated by British South American Airways, had departed from Barbados en route to Jamaica, carrying a small complement of passengers and crew. Radio operators logged the initial transmissions without alarm as all systems appeared nominal and the weather was reported as fair. Yet over the course of its flight, a subtle misalignment in reported positions began to emerge, marking the first hints of an unfolding enigma that would later be tied to the region's enduring mysteries. 3 crew members and 10 passengers settled into the cabin, their preparations meticulous and procedural. Flight logs confirm that Captain Robert Dixon, an experienced pilot familiar with Caribbean routes, oversaw departure and instrument checks personally. Co-pilot and radio officer duties were allocated according to standard operating procedure, and all passengers were briefed on expected flight duration. There was no indication of unusual conditions, yet contemporary accounts suggest that even minor deviations in navigational calculations could have profound consequences over the open waters stretching toward Jamaica, where visual cues are limited and currents are unpredictable. The flight commenced along its charted path, engines steady and instruments verified. Initially, the DC-3 maintained its expected heading and altitude, progressing across a placid stretch of the Caribbean Sea. The sky was clear for the first half hour, with minimal turbulence, and radio communications were routine, reporting position updates at expected intervals. Observers at Barbados's control tower noted no irregularities, and no adverse weather warnings were issued. Despite the normal outward appearance, small discrepancies in wind correction angles and heading calculations were already emerging, imperceptible at first but destined to accumulate into a navigational divergence. Controllers first observed unusual deviations when the aircraft transmitted its position report at 10:03 p.m. local time. The coordinates placed the plane significantly off the expected flight path, closer to open water east of Jamaica than its scheduled route. The anomaly was minor on paper, but notable against prior consistency. Attempts to clarify via radio elicited brief acknowledgements, but no elaboration. The crew's voice remained calm, conveying no distress. Yet the mismatch between charted position and transmitted coordinates introduced a tension that would only deepen as subsequent transmissions unfolded. Efforts to reconcile the reported location with navigational charts revealed a subtle but persistent misalignment. Plotting the last known coordinates against expected waypoints suggested that the DC-3 was slowly drifting northward, against calculated wind and heading corrections. Neither standard navigational instruments nor prior route familiarity offered a clear explanation. The anomaly intensified as the flight progressed, creating an impression that the aircraft was moving in a manner inconsistent with pilot intentions and meteorological data, a situation later described by investigators as perplexing and unprecedented for a flight of this nature. Radio transmissions became increasingly intermittent over the following minutes. Routine position calls were occasionally lost or distorted, leaving brief gaps that prevented the control tower from tracking the aircraft continuously. Officers at Kingston Airport reported sporadic signals, sometimes difficult to triangulate accurately. Despite the crew's apparent adherence to protocol, these fragmented exchanges introduced an air of uncertainty. The combination of fading signal strength, nightfall, and distance from reliable shore-based radio stations compounded the challenge, leaving the DC-3 effectively unmoored in both physical and communicative space. The pilots attempted multiple corrective measures using compass checks and visual references to celestial bodies. Darkened skies and scattered clouds interfered with star sightings, while the ocean's surface reflected minimal light, complicating horizon orientation. Adjustments in heading were made carefully, with repeated verification across instruments, yet each correction failed to realign the aircraft with the projected route. Investigators later noted that the small errors, compounded by minor atmospheric currents and potential instrument variation, could create significant displacement over time, a plausible explanation for the progressively inaccurate positions reported by the crew. Environmental factors further compounded navigational challenges. Local magnetic variation in the region can produce deviations for aircraft compasses if not properly corrected, and optical illusions over the water can mislead pilots accustomed to terrestrial reference points. The interplay of scattered clouds, intermittent moonlight, and slight surface glare from waves may have created a distorted sense of movement and orientation. While weather reports indicated no severe storms, these subtle factors could influence perception, particularly during night operations over open sea, where every minor misreading could accumulate into a critical error in trajectory. The final SOS transmission, recorded shortly after 10:40 p.m, presented coordinates increasingly at odds with maps and projected waypoints. The message, though calm, conveyed a location that diverged sharply from planned navigation. The absence of additional communication left controllers and investigators with no means of assistance or guidance. The report contained only factual position information, yet its accuracy was uncertain, and it would become the last official trace of the aircraft's passage. Beyond this point, the DC-3 effectively disappeared from radar and radio reach, leaving only speculation based on its final coordinates. Search operations commenced immediately, spanning hundreds of square miles of ocean between Barbados and Jamaica. Ships and aircraft deployed along projected corridors, utilizing both visual scanning and sonar detection where feasible. Currents, however, particularly the prevailing Caribbean stream, posed a significant obstacle to locating any potential debris. Darkness hindered observation, and the vastness of the region meant that even sizable wreckage could remain unseen. These factors contributed to a search that was thorough yet ultimately unsuccessful, leaving the aircraft's disappearance unresolved. Scattered reports from other vessels hinted at lights or objects on the water, though these were inconsistent and unverified. Some suggested distant flares, while others mentioned fleeting glimmers resembling an aircraft fuselage. Attempts to cross-reference these sightings with search coordinates yielded no definitive matches. Investigators classified the reports as uncorroborated, noting both the potential for human misperception and the influence of nightfall over reflective water. Despite these uncertainties, the sightings became part of the broader narrative of vanishing aircraft in the region, adding to the atmosphere of mystery surrounding the DC-3. Analysis following the disappearance considered multiple potential causes. Mechanical failure, such as engine malfunction or fuel system irregularities, could not be ruled out, though pre-flight inspections indicated all systems were operational. Navigational miscalculations remained a central theory, particularly given the unusual divergence in reported coordinates. Sudden weather anomalies, including isolated squalls or wind shears, were also evaluated. The absence of recovered wreckage prevented any definitive conclusion, leaving investigators reliant on radio transcripts, meteorological data, and probabilistic modelling to attempt reconstruction of the aircraft's final path. The DC-3's unresolved fate became one of the early cases tied to the region later described as the Bermuda Triangle. Its final coordinates, recorded in fading radio transmissions, symbolise a point where human planning and expectation intersected with the unpredictability of open water and atmospheric variation. Researchers have since examined similar disappearances to identify commonalities, yet each case maintains distinctive elements that defy simple explanation. The flight remains a focal point in studies of aviation anomalies and maritime law, where documented fact intersects with enduring speculation. The flight's mysterious disappearance left a lasting impression, shaping both public perception and official understanding of the hazards associated with open-air navigation over the Caribbean. Without physical evidence, the narrative rests on the clarity of recorded transmissions, contrasted against the silence that followed. Every analysis reinforces the contrast between meticulous planning and sudden, unexplained absence. The DC-3 NC-16002's final coordinates, precise in numerical form yet impossible to trace physically, continue to evoke both fascination and unease among aviation historians and Bermuda Triangle researchers alike. The coordinates stopped speaking, leaving only empty sky and an ocean that holds its secret without a single trace. Marine Sulphur Queen's broken signal. The Marine Sulphur Queen departed from Beaumont, Texas, with a cargo of molten sulphur, its crew unaware that their journey would culminate in one of the most enigmatic maritime disappearances ever linked to the Bermuda Triangle. The vessel's initial radio checks were routine, reporting clear skies and calm seas, but the final transmissions would later emerge as fragmented echoes of a voyage that vanished without trace. Over the following hours, the ship's routine would fracture subtly, leaving only incomplete communications and unanswered questions to mark its path. Investigators later noted that these early messages reflected normal operations, but even small irregularities in radio clarity hinted at conditions that would confound the ship entirely. Following its standard course along the Gulf of Mexico, the tanker navigated toward Norfolk, Virginia, tracing a path that commercial shipping logs described as familiar and uneventful. Every course, correction and engine check adhered to the protocols of a vessel designed for heavy, high-temperature cargo, emphasizing routine efficiency over any immediate sense of peril. Yet the ocean itself remained an unpredictable force, capable of isolating even the most well-handled vessel from rescue or observation. Mariners at the time recognized that the Gulf's shifting currents and unseen shoals could obscure navigational certainty, and the Marine Sulphur Queen, though technologically capable, was still subject to nature's indifference. 13 crew members maintained the vessel's operation, rotating through watch shifts that kept a constant eye on engine pressures, sulfur temperature, and radio communications. Their tasks were meticulously documented in the ship's logs, providing investigators with the last recorded accounts of ordinary maritime vigilance before signals began to fragment. Each man carried responsibility not only for his immediate duties but for the collective safety of the ship, a burden that would be tested in ways unforeseen. Historical accounts suggest the crew maintained disciplined routines, including detailed hourly logs, yet no note suggested anticipation of the catastrophic silence that would follow. Weather reports indicated mild winds and scattered clouds across the Gulf, conditions considered favourable for the journey, yet the sea itself presented invisible hazards that could rapidly complicate even standard navigation. Currents ran unpredictable beneath the vessel's keel, carrying with them a subtle reminder of the ocean's indifference to human schedules and mechanical reliability. Mariners of the era were acutely aware that even calm waters could conceal sudden shifts or unseen dangers lurking below the surface. In addition, the Gulf is subject to sudden squalls, temperature inversions, and local whirlpools that might not appear on forecasts but could affect a large heavy tanker in ways imperceptible to those on board. The cargo of molten sulphur, kept at temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Celsius, required constant attention, with careful management of heat and flow to prevent solidification or destabilization. While commercially routine, these operational demands introduced complexities unique to this type of tanker, underscoring that even ordinary conditions could carry hidden risk. The delicate balance between cargo safety and vessel stability would persist as a silent factor throughout the voyage. Records indicate that sulphur tankers also faced chemical hazards from accidental exposure to fumes, requiring constant monitoring of ventilation systems which could themselves malfunction under mechanical strain. Early communications reflected a well-functioning routine, with hourly position reports confirming steady progress along the projected route. Each transmission reinforced the expectation that the voyage would continue without incident, masking the subtle deterioration of radio clarity that would later alarm authorities. Signals began to exhibit static interruptions and irregularities, hinting at either technical issues or conditions beyond immediate comprehension. Observers noted that the breaks coincided with periods when the vessel would have been furthest from shore-based receiving stations, suggesting either technical vulnerability or interference caused by atmospheric conditions over the Gulf waters. The first unusual signal disruptions appeared subtly, with static interspersed among routine updates, leaving operators to note incomplete coordinates that hinted at irregularities but provided no cause for immediate alarm. These fragmented transmissions, seemingly technical at first, would later be interpreted as the ship's final attempts to report its position. Analysts would pore over the logs, attempting to reconstruct the vessel's last hours from partial frequency sweeps and broken call signs. Even minor delays or distortions could mean the difference between safe rescue and total loss at sea, and investigators acknowledged that a simple communication lapse could conceal far more than a mechanical problem. The vessel itself, a T2 tanker converted for molten sulphur transport, had a documented history of operational caution, including extensive internal compartments and ventilation systems designed to minimize cargo hazards. Yet despite these engineering safeguards, the combination of flammable material, confined spaces, and maritime unpredictability created a scenario where disaster could unfold without warning. Historical records indicated that even minor malfunctions could cascade quickly under the right or wrong circumstances. Maritime engineers of the era emphasized that the heat of molten sulphur could create pressure differentials sufficient to affect structural integrity in localized compartments, a detail often overlooked in casual accounts. Search efforts commenced once the Marine Sulphur Queen failed to relay scheduled updates, involving Coast Guard cutters and nearby commercial vessels scanning a vast and uncertain area. The grid expanded quickly, but the Gulf's currents, shifting weather bands, and scattered visibility complicated even well-coordinated maritime observation. Investigators relied heavily on extrapolated coordinates and the vessel's intended route to prioritize areas of focus, yet the enormity of the search area allowed ample space for the ship to disappear. Records indicate that search crews faced not only the challenge of size, but also the Gulf's low-lying fog, which could mask visual detection for hours, further diminishing the chance of recovery. Nightfall over the Gulf intensified the challenge, with darkness obscuring surface patterns and hiding any potential debris from sighting or radar detection. The vessel's disappearance, in such conditions, left investigators reliant on procedural analysis, incomplete radio logs, and sparse eyewitness accounts rather than direct confirmation of the ship's fate. Even nearby ships could traverse the same waters without ever encountering trace evidence, leaving only speculation to fill the void. The absence of floating sulfur residue, which might have survived even a catastrophic sinking, added to the puzzle, suggesting either rapid dispersal by the currents or a more sudden, complete loss. Official inquiries examined technical possibilities, including structural compromise, cargo instability, and equipment failure, yet none could be confirmed without physical evidence. Reports emphasized probability over certainty, acknowledging that the absence of debris and the broken radio signals limited definitive conclusions about what had occurred. Each theory, whether mechanical, human, or environmental, remained unverified, emphasizing the unresolved nature of the tragedy. Naval engineers reviewed internal schematics to identify potential stress points, but even the most detailed technical reconstruction could not overcome the absence of the vessel itself. Cultural memory and maritime folklore quickly enveloped the disappearance, situating the marine Sulphur Queen among the growing list of Bermuda Triangle mysteries that fascinated public imagination and professional investigation alike. The vessel's unexplained vanishing contributed to broader speculation about the region, though surviving records remained methodical, dry, and focused on observable facts rather than sensational interpretation. Public fascination contrasted with investigative restraint, leaving an enduring tension between legend and documented evidence. Articles from the 1960s highlighted the dramatic circumstances, yet official summaries maintained a careful record of broken signals and absent wreckage, underscoring mystery without conjecture. In the end, the ship's last transmitted fragments of position data and its fading signals mark the only trace left of the marine Sulphur Queen, drifting unseen into uncertainty. The Gulf's currents could have dispersed debris instantly, and darkness could have concealed even large objects, yet the absence of wreckage or survivor testimony remains striking. Its final moments are recorded not in bodies or salvage, but in silent radio echoes that hint at catastrophe without revealing cause, leaving investigators and historians alike to grapple with a maritime disappearance that challenges even technical reasoning. As the Gulf's waters swallowed all trace of the vessel, the broken signal remained the only testimony to a journey that vanished without a trace. The Witchcraft's call for assistance. Through static-laced transmissions, the Witchcraft's final call for assistance reached attentive ears, a desperate signal that would become one of the most perplexing unsolved messages from the Bermuda Triangle. The vessel, a T2 tanker engaged in routine coastal operations, had reported routine course updates only hours before, and yet the brief fragment of a distress signal suggested an immediate threat unknown to anyone on shore. Maritime logs confirmed her departure and initial position, but the incomplete nature of the transmission left a haunting ambiguity. What had compelled a ship with decades of service to issue such a call without follow-up? Observers later noted that the signal, though short, reflected a distinct urgency, a professional acknowledgement of danger that carried the authority of experienced mariners yet ended in silence. Every word transmitted carried a weight of urgency, hinting at a developing crisis that the ship's crew had not anticipated, yet the meaning remained partially obscured by signal interference. Operators monitoring radio frequencies noted distorted phrases, with repeated syllables breaking into static before any complete message could be received. The fragments conveyed fear, disorientation, and a potential mechanical or environmental emergency, but investigators would later confront the frustration of attempting to interpret these echoes without corroborating evidence. Analysts would also highlight the rarity of a T2 vessel issuing such an SOS without immediate follow-up. The abruptness of the call itself suggested a situation that unfolded faster than standard maritime contingencies could accommodate. The tanker's engines hummed steadily beneath the deck, a counterpoint to the trembling uncertainty encoded in each fragmented radio report. Engineering logs indicated no irregularities, no overheating or unexpected pressure fluctuations that might have triggered alarm. Yet within the hum of diesel machinery and the rhythmic churning of the pumps that managed ballast and cargo, the crew had encountered something imperceptible to instrumentation, a circumstance so sudden and subtle that only the SOS itself suggested peril. Investigators would later note that no unusual vibrations, noises, or equipment anomalies were recorded in any shipboard logs, leaving the transmission as the sole indication of a developing emergency. Deckhands rotated between observation posts and engine checks, performing the repetitive, precise tasks that had kept the vessel operational for years. The crew's experience allowed for minimal deviation from standard procedures, yet in maritime operations, even familiarity cannot guard against the ocean's unpredictable interventions. Each watchful sailor maintained vigilance over deck equipment, hatches, and navigational lights, unknowingly recording their final ordinary movements against the backdrop of an extraordinary disappearance. Logs indicated that personnel followed protocol meticulously, with no deviations, reinforcing the notion that whatever prompted the call occurred beyond the range of standard operational warning systems. Behind the bridge, navigational instruments recorded coordinates and course corrections in meticulous detail, yet each entry would later reveal only hints of a path that could not be retraced. The ship's log, examined after the vanishing, documented headings and distances consistent with standard operating procedures. Yet, when compared against the SOS fragments, a dissonance emerged. The crew had reported being off course or experiencing conditions inconsistent with the instrument's data, raising questions about sudden environmental forces or navigational anomalies beyond human perception. Scholars studying the case later noted that local currents in the Bermuda Triangle can shift unpredictably, and subtle magnetic variations might have further confused navigation, though such effects remain speculative without corroboration. Even routine weather updates became laden with tension, as mild winds and scattered clouds belied the ocean's capacity for sudden unpredictability. The Gulf Stream, powerful and capricious, could redirect floating debris or create localized currents invisible to the naked eye. Despite benign skies, the vessel may have encountered conditions that altered its stability or the integrity of its cargo. Mariners understood that even a placid horizon can conceal turbulence, and the fragmentary radio transmissions hinted that the crew recognized such a hazard too late. Oceanographers later pointed out that small, fast-moving eddies in the region could create unexpected tilts in a loaded tanker, influencing cargo stability in ways not immediately apparent to those on deck. The cargo, liquid sulfur maintained at extreme temperatures, demanded constant attention, its presence introducing subtle operational hazards that might have interacted with environmental conditions. Temperatures had to be monitored precisely, with valves and pumps regulating flow to prevent solidification or pressure buildup. A miscalculation, minor leak or sudden shift in the vessel's orientation could initiate a chain reaction within the storage tanks. While no evidence suggests this occurred, the combination of combustible material and maritime unpredictability remained a compelling element in investigations. Historical records confirmed that T2 tankers carrying molten sulfur had rarely experienced issues, but the potential for rapid destabilization existed, particularly if unusual movements or sudden stresses were applied to the hull. Radio operators monitored the ship's transmissions with growing concern, noting intermittent breaks, distorted call signs, and partial coordinates. Each interruption prompted efforts to request clarification or repeated position reports, but only fragments returned, their content incomplete and often unintelligible. Analysts studying these signals would later reconstruct timelines that suggested the ship's crew attempted to maintain contact despite deteriorating conditions. Their determination reflected solely in the surviving fragmented recordings. Observers highlighted the difficulty of distinguishing between static caused by technical failure and the possibility of interference from environmental anomalies, leaving every word open to interpretation. Technical officers examined engine performance, fuel flow, and electrical systems in real time, yet each parameter appeared within normal limits. There were no recorded alarms, no mechanical anomalies reported, and no warnings that would have foreshadowed catastrophe. The absence of tangible evidence challenged investigators, leaving only speculation about the sudden impetus for the SOS. Whether a structural failure, an environmental disruption, or a combination of factors had prompted the call remained impossible to verify with certainty. Maritime engineers emphasized that, in such vessels, latent stress fractures or minor leaks could exist unnoticed for hours, potentially triggering emergency conditions without prior warning. As messages fractured into intermittent bursts of static, investigators later speculated on how sudden mechanical failure, navigational error, or environmental anomaly could have produced a scenario where a single SOS would mark the last trace. Each theory drew upon technical manuals, meteorological records, and maritime precedent. Experts noted that T2 tankers, though robust, had been vulnerable in extreme conditions, particularly when cargo stability intersected with wave patterns, localized currents, or equipment stress. Yet all remained hypothetical in the absence of recovered wreckage. Discussions also considered human factors. A highly trained crew might recognize imminent danger but lack sufficient time to respond under the compounded pressures of multiple, simultaneous anomalies. search parties expanded their grid in the days following the call, scanning thousands of square miles, but currents, wind, and shifting weather bands conspired to conceal debris or clues. The coordinated operation included Coast Guard cutters, commercial vessels, and aircraft equipped for maritime observation. Yet even with modern techniques, the area proved vast and unyielding. The absence of sighted wreckage lent weight to theories of a rapid, sudden loss, where the vessel disappeared before standard distress responses could unfold. Some debris fields were theorized but never confirmed, suggesting either complete submersion or dispersal by the Gulf Stream faster than search crews could respond. Analysts debated every possible scenario, from sudden structural compromise to the accidental ignition of cargo vapors, each theory plausible yet unprovable. Internal explosions, ruptured tanks, or even catastrophic environmental interference were considered, but none could be confirmed. Radio logs, maritime charts, and eyewitness accounts provided fragments of context, yet none offered resolution. Each scenario, while conceivable, remained hypothetical, emphasizing the enduring uncertainty surrounding the SOS. Later studies also revisited the vessel's maintenance history and previous inspections, confirming that all documented systems had been reported in working order shortly before departure, further deepening the mystery. The crew's last communications, distorted and incomplete, continue to resonate within archives and investigations, representing the only tangible link to a ship that may have been claimed by sudden catastrophe. These fragments, captured across fleeting moments of connectivity, remain haunting, a mixture of human urgency, professional diligence, and the inexorable silence that followed. They are reminders that even the most experienced sailors, commanding robust vessels, may vanish without a trace when conditions align beyond expectation or understanding. The silence that followed the fragmented SOS has since become a defining element in studies of maritime disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, leaving the Witchcraft story unresolved. The Witchcraft's call lingered in the ether, unanswered and incomplete, a solitary testament to a voyage swallowed by the sea's quiet enigma. The C-54 Skymaster's incomplete transmission. Across static and fading airwaves, the Skymaster's last call for assistance emerged, a brief and fractured SOS that would remain unresolved in the annals of the Bermuda Triangle. The message reached distant monitoring stations, faint but unmistakable, its clipped urgency hinting at circumstances that had developed too swiftly for complete documentation. The aircraft, a C-54 Skymaster with decades of proven service in both military and commercial aviation, had reported routine waypoints and altitude checks only hours before. Yet the fragmentary nature of the final transmission left investigators grasping for context. What had prompted a vessel so well prepared and experienced to signal distress without any subsequent clarification? The aircraft cruised steadily over the open Atlantic, its instruments humming with the quiet reliability of routine, as though nothing could hint at the abrupt anomaly that lay ahead. Pilots of the era trusted the combination of mechanical precision and navigational charts to guide them safely, confident in the aircraft's capacity to endure hours of oceanic flight. The Skymaster's twin-piston engines, carefully maintained, produced a constant low-frequency vibration that seemed to reassure crew members of stability, even as the vastness of the Atlantic stretched beneath them. To all outward appearances, the journey continued without incident, and yet the final transmission would suggest otherwise. Within the cockpit, the crew maintained strict attention to dials, gauges, and course headings, performing practiced rotations that had guided countless hours of uneventful flight. Each member had a defined role, from monitoring fuel levels to logging positional data, with decisions coordinated to prevent error over the expanse of open water. They communicated in clipped professional cadence, checking instrument readings against expected performance, and noting atmospheric conditions that could influence navigation. It was routine, precise, and disciplined, a controlled environment suddenly interrupted by the imperceptible signal that would later haunt analysts. Intermittent interruptions began to ripple through radio channels, fragmenting the crew's voice into a pattern of syllables and static that confounded distant operators. Each burst of transmission carried a mixture of clarity and distortion, some words intelligible, others lost entirely to interference. The station receiving the signal recorded only partial coordinates, disjointed phrases, and repeated requests for acknowledgement, leaving technicians to reconstruct the SOS from fragmented pulses. Over time, these interruptions became the sole evidence of a developing crisis that had eluded visual observation and mechanical monitoring, an anomaly that would remain unsolved for decades. Technical readings indicated flawless engine performance, stable fuel flow, and unremarkable electrical systems, offering no explanation for the sudden transmission that would come to define the flight. Logs show that oil pressure, cylinder temperatures, and hydraulic function remained within nominal ranges, and no alarms were tripped during the period surrounding the SOS. Investigators, examining the surviving maintenance records, noted that the Skymaster's systems were robust and well maintained, capable of enduring turbulence, engine strain, and extended oceanic flights. Yet the call for assistance suggested that whatever the crew experienced, it was imperceptible to the very instruments designed to ensure their safety. Charted coordinates and logged altitudes recorded precise movement, yet the incomplete SOS hinted at dislocation or conditions the instruments could not register. Each entry in the flight log reflected adherence to navigational procedure, with headings and timestamped distances corresponding to the planned route. Still, the fragmented transmission implied a sudden challenge, a discrepancy between the expected position and a perception of danger. Whether caused by atmospheric distortion, magnetic anomaly, or an unseen oceanic hazard, this divergence between the factual record and the emergency call became a focal point for researchers trying to unravel the Skymaster's disappearance. Clouds drifted in sparse bands above the Skymaster, and gentle winds whispered across the fuselage, masking any suggestion of the oceanic anomaly that might have prompted the call. Weather reports from the day indicated generally favourable conditions, with no storms reported along the projected flight path. Nonetheless, pilots were well aware that even subtle turbulence or uncharted microcurrents could influence flight dynamics over the Atlantic. The isolation inherent to extended overwater operations compounded the significance of any anomalous occurrence. A minor disturbance could escalate swiftly when immediate assistance was unavailable, lending urgency to the SOS. Hands moved with practiced efficiency over throttles and controls, minds attuned to patterns, while the urgency embedded in the fragmented SOS hinted at challenges beyond training or expectation. Crew members monitored compass headings, altimeter readings, and engine instruments, executing maneuvers with precision. Each control input was deliberate, measured, and designed to maintain stability over long stretches of water. Yet the call for help suggested that the Skymaster faced a scenario for which protocol offered little guidance, one that was incomprehensible in both scope and immediacy. The Skymaster had long served as a reliable long-range transport, its design emphasizing endurance, balance, and mechanical resilience. Yet even its proven robustness offered no immunity to sudden calamity. Engineers familiar with the C-54 series highlighted the aircraft's capacity for heavy cargo, extended flight, and repeated service without failure. Its reputation as a dependable workhorse belied the fact that environmental variables, magnetic deviations, oceanic turbulence, or rapid atmospheric shifts could still create conditions where a single, incomplete SOS became the only signal of distress. Analysts pieced together syllables and partial coordinates from surviving logs, attempting to reconstruct the timeline of distress amid the ocean's vast, indifferent expanse. Each fragmentary signal provided clues. The moment the call began, repeated phrases and interruptions in transmission suggested both urgency and a short window for response. Radio operators attempted triangulation, but the lack of continuous contact prevented definitive positioning. Investigators could only extrapolate probable locations, leaving a mosaic of educated conjecture that emphasized the mystery rather than resolving it. Vast search grids were established, yet Gulf Stream currents, shifting weather bands, and the sheer scope of the Atlantic frustrated all efforts to locate debris or survivors. Aircraft patrolled in daylight, and cutters swept the water's surface, scanning for oil slicks, floating wreckage, or other signs of a catastrophic event. Despite these measures, the sea yielded nothing definitive. Investigators noted that even a relatively large aircraft could vanish under the confluence of deep water, strong currents, and delayed detection, leaving only the SOS fragments as evidence of its final moments. Experts debated scenarios ranging from sudden structural failure to navigational anomalies or rapid mechanical malfunction, acknowledging that no theory could claim confirmation without physical evidence. internal failures, electrical faults, or even a combination of environmental and mechanical factors were plausible, yet remained speculative. Technical manuals, historical incident reports, and contemporary meteorological data informed each hypothesis, yet none could account fully for the abruptness of the Skymaster's last transmission. Each possibility highlighted the vulnerability of human craft amid an expansive and uncharted maritime environment. The fragmented SOS remained the only tangible remnant of the Skymaster's voyage, its resonance persisting in archival records and haunting subsequent generations of investigators. It represented a fleeting connection between human intent and the boundless ocean, an urgent plea that the sea itself had absorbed. Decades later, researchers continue to revisit the incomplete transmission, examining signal patterns, flight path reconstructions, and potential environmental factors in hopes of uncovering insight that has so far eluded every investigation. The Skymaster's incomplete transmission drifted across the Atlantic, a faint echo of a journey that ended in unanswered mystery, suspended between human endeavour and the sea's indifferent expanse. The Sandra's last cargo report. Over radio frequencies that crackled with intermittent interference, the Sandra's last cargo report flickered into existence, its urgency barely perceptible beneath static. The transmission, brief and fragmented, would become the vessel's final known communication from the Bermuda Triangle, hinting at trouble that no observer could fully interpret. Shore-based operators noted the unusual cadence of the call, but with the message incomplete and no immediate distress signal following, it would remain an enigma, leaving investigators decades later to reconstruct events from fragments alone. The ship had departed on a routine voyage, yet the faint urgency contained in that single broadcast would transform an ordinary crossing into a case of enduring mystery. Even small details, hesitations, repeated syllables, and static bursts added layers of intrigue, suggesting the crew had encountered a problem both sudden and confounding, invisible to the instruments and unspoken in the logs. The tanker traced a steady course along well-charted shipping lanes, its hull cutting cleanly through calm waters as if unaware of any imminent peril. Logs indicate that all navigational readings corresponded to expected headings, the vessel maintaining speed and course with precise discipline. From the deck, the horizon appeared placid, with light swells and scattered clouds concealing no obvious signs of hazard. Sunlight glinted off the water, reflecting a sense of order and routine that belied the unfolding mystery beneath the surface. The ship's adherence to protocol suggested normalcy, yet the subsequent disappearance would reveal the gulf between apparent order and the unforeseen forces of the ocean, a contrast mirrored in every fragment of the final transmission. On deck, crew members moved with practiced precision, alternating between navigational oversight, watch duties, and cargo monitoring, their experience masking any hint of concern. The ship's operation relied on coordinated shifts, each member attuned to instruments, radar, and visual cues. These routines, repeated countless times across prior voyages, were designed to mitigate both human error and environmental uncertainty. Yet even seasoned sailors, commanding a robust tanker under ideal weather conditions, could not anticipate the circumstances that prompted the vessel's final, incomplete report. The subtle tension in each interrupted broadcast hinted that the crew perceived something beyond conventional threat, a nuance lost to those reviewing only fragments decades later. Below the main deck, storage compartments held the cargo in regulated conditions, the careful maintenance of temperature and pressure consuming constant attention. The Sandra's cargo, sensitive to both heat and movement, required monitoring that demanded both skill and diligence. Valves, pumps, and pressure gauges were continuously adjusted to prevent destabilization, ensuring that the vessel could transport its load safely. While the operation was routine in design, it introduced subtle operational hazards that could intersect catastrophically with sudden environmental or mechanical anomalies, a scenario investigators would later scrutinize in depth. Even minor perturbations in cargo stability could compound with ocean currents or wind shifts, creating conditions invisible to the crew yet sufficient to prompt a last desperate call. Early communications with shore and nearby vessels revealed no irregularities, confirming routine progress while concealing the subtle beginnings of disruption. The logs and position reports presented a veneer of normalcy, with each scheduled update transmitted on time and consistent with maritime standards. Yet amid these routine reports, the first hints of abnormality appeared in the form of slight signal degradation, occasional crackling, and fleeting static that interrupted the clarity of coordinates. What seemed at first a technical nuisance would eventually become the only trace of the ship's final movements, a digital breadcrumb signalling unseen tension between vessel and environment. Gradually, static punctuated otherwise normal transmissions, breaking coordinates and call signs into fragments that hinted at a developing unseen hazard. Analysts reviewing radio logs noted repeated syllables and truncated phrases, each interruption suggesting the crew's attempt to communicate under conditions they could not fully describe. Unlike conventional distress calls, these fragments conveyed no complete sentence or explicit warning, offering only glimpses of urgency and disorientation. The result was a puzzle, a vessel functioning within all observable parameters, attempting to report a crisis that left no trace beyond its own fragmented signal. The ambiguity of the transmissions, words half heard, numbers truncated, amplified the mystery, as if the ocean itself had absorbed the remainder. Monitoring instruments, including engine readings and electrical diagnostics, remained within operational norms, offering no clue to the cause of the distress. Every meter, gauge, and logging device indicated stability. The engines hummed with steady power, electrical circuits showed no anomalies, and fuel systems operated as designed. Yet amid this mechanical normality, the crew had evidently perceived a threat substantial enough to transmit an SOS. The contradiction between instrument readings and the crew's behaviour added to the enduring mystery, raising questions about sudden, invisible dangers that might elude both human perception and technological monitoring. Even the most sophisticated diagnostics could detect nothing that explained the fragmented urgency in the radio waves. Weather reports and oceanic observations indicated unremarkable conditions, yet the invisible currents and eddies of the Atlantic posed threats imperceptible to crew and instrumentation alike. Mariners long recognized that even calm seas can conceal swift currents, shifting undersea formations, or abrupt weather microclimates. The Gulf Stream and localized eddies could alter a vessel's orientation or destabilize sensitive cargo, but no recorded anomalies suggested such forces were at play. Nevertheless, these factors remain a plausible consideration, as the fragmentary nature of the final transmission left investigators with only hypothetical explanations. Even subtle shifts beneath the hull could induce stress undetectable above deck, an unseen ballet of forces leaving no trace but the urgency in the crew's voice. Search operations were mobilized swiftly, deploying cutters, patrol aircraft, and radar sweeps across a vast expanse. Yet the Sandra remained elusive. The coordinated effort combed thousands of square miles, focusing on the last reported coordinates, potential drift zones, and shipping lanes. Despite modern tracking techniques and extensive manpower, no debris, floating containers, or signs of distress were found. The absence of any recoverable material lent weight to the theory that the vessel may have succumbed to a sudden catastrophic event, one that left no opportunity for standard emergency procedures to unfold. Every passing hour reinforced the isolation of the vessel, leaving the static-filled call as the sole witness to its fate. Analysts examined every possibility documented in manuals, prior incidents, and maritime charts, from structural vulnerability to cargo hazards, finding only conjecture where certainty was absent. Hypotheses ranged from sudden structural failure of the hull to internal destabilization of the cargo tanks. Some considered environmental interference, such as rogue waves, shifting currents, or localized pressure phenomena. Others explored potential navigational error, though the precision of prior course logs complicated this explanation. Yet all remained speculative, as the incomplete transmission provided the only tangible link to a sudden incident that remained hidden beneath the Atlantic's surface. Even decades later, models could suggest only scenarios, never definitive cause. The broken fragments of the final cargo report persisted, a faint echo of human intent drifting through the void, unanswered and unresolved. Each fragment revealed the crew's attempt to convey location, condition, and urgency, but none could fully communicate the situation at hand. The haunting quality of these transmissions has prompted decades of scrutiny, inspiring both technical analysis and public fascination. They remain emblematic of the Bermuda Triangle's mysteries, a fleeting human voice swallowed by the vast indifferent sea, The repetition, the garbled coordinates, the disjointed syllables, they linger as remnants of a voyage suspended between order and chaos. Shipping logs, manifest records, and navigational entries provided meticulous documentation of the voyage, yet offered no resolution to the anomaly encoded in the final transmission. Every detail from engine hours to cargo temperature was recorded with precision, creating a picture of normal operations up until the abrupt disappearance. The contrast between methodical record-keeping and sudden vanishing underscores the unsettling nature of the event. A ship documented in total control one moment, erased from physical verification the next. The persistence of this tension continues to drive both investigators and maritime enthusiasts, who revisit the sparse evidence in search of a hidden clue. As investigators piece together fragments of evidence, the vanishing remained complete, leaving behind only a message hinting at disaster that never fully unfolded. Despite exhaustive searches, careful charting of currents, and repeated simulations of possible incidents, no definitive answer emerged. The vessel's disappearance, recorded in fragments of radio communication and meticulous logs, continues to occupy a space between probability and the unexplained, sustaining both professional inquiry and public intrigue. The interplay between human effort and natural mystery remains frozen in the silent broadcasts that slipped into the Atlantic night. The Sandra's last cargo report drifted across radio waves, a fleeting trace of certainty swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the Atlantic. The SSL Faro's hurricane transmission. Grey clouds stretched across the horizon as the SSL Faro prepared to leave port, engines humming and decks bustling with routine activity. Crew members carried out last-minute inspections, checking lifeboats, securing loose equipment, and reviewing cargo manifests. On deck, the faint brine of the Atlantic clung to surfaces, and the wind hinted at an energy not yet visible. The vessel's schedule was clear, its path carefully plotted, yet beneath this veneer of preparation lay the latent tension of a journey soon to confront nature's most indiscriminate forces. It was an ordinary departure that would transform into one of the most studied and haunting maritime mysteries in the Bermuda Triangle. The vessel moved steadily through familiar shipping lanes, its massive hull cutting silently through waters that appeared deceptively calm. Radar and navigation systems hummed steadily, projecting coordinates, headings, and estimated times of arrival with precise calculations. The ship's massive silhouette reflected routine professionalism, a leviathan of steel that had weathered countless crossings. Yet the placid appearance of the sea was misleading. Beneath its surface, currents shifted unpredictably, and the approaching storm, though not yet fully manifest, carried a potency that would soon challenge both human skill and mechanical endurance. From the bridge, watchstanders scanned the seas, noting subtle shifts in wind and swell that hinted at the storm advancing unseen. Clouds thickened along the horizon in rolling layers, their grey tones deepening into turbulent shades that suggested energy gathering over miles of open water. Though barometers and weather instruments reported only gradual changes, experienced eyes discerned a rhythm in the waves and wind, a quiet warning that the Atlantic would not remain passive. The crew's intuition, honed over years of service, picked up signals invisible to technology, subtle clues that the ordinary voyage was about to become extraordinary. Below deck, engineers and technicians monitored machinery and cargo conditions, their diligence masking the latent tension gathering above. Diesel engines throbbed steadily, and the electrical grid showed no signs of fluctuation, each system operating within design tolerances. Valves, pumps, and control systems were regularly inspected, the cargo hold secured against both temperature shifts and structural stress. The juxtaposition between the apparent calm of engineering reports and the storm's advancing threat created a silent tension, a gap between measured normality and the unpredictability looming beyond the hull. Far offshore, weather reports detailed a storm that had yet to make its full presence felt, but its approach was undeniable to those trained to notice nuance. Satellite images and storm tracking suggested a hurricane forming over warm waters, intensifying with a slow, inevitable force. Meteorologists predicted rapid strengthening, and yet no immediate course correction had been issued. The vessel maintained its heading, unaware that the surrounding air and water were already beginning to test its resilience. These unseen forces would challenge every assumption of maritime safety, leaving human judgment and technology in delicate balance. The ship's hull, though recently inspected and maintained, carried the hidden weight of years at sea, with microscopic corrosion and fatigue that only thorough underwater surveys could reveal. Steel plates were reinforced in key sections, and watertight bulkheads were regularly tested, yet even the most meticulous maintenance could not eliminate latent vulnerabilities. Ballast systems redistributed weight to stabilize cargo tanks, and engine outputs were carefully balanced to prevent undue stress. Observers later noted that T2 class tankers like the SSL Faro, despite their robustness, had experienced structural challenges under extreme wave action, particularly when loaded near full capacity. These hidden structural factors, invisible to the crew in routine operations, may have subtly amplified the effects of the hurricane long before any transmission signaled danger. As the voyage progressed, the first signs of challenge appeared. Sharper swells, sporadic gusts, and the faint scent of rain carried on the wind. Crew members reported subtle rolling that deviated from standard wave patterns, but these early warnings were considered manageable. On the bridge, officers noted slight adjustments to speed and heading to compensate for emerging currents. Below decks, monitoring systems recorded minor vibrations in the engine room, fluctuations within safe ranges but perceptible to trained hands. It was the beginning of a gradual confrontation with forces that would escalate far beyond expectation. Crew members rotated between stations with practiced precision, securing lines, checking instruments, and observing decks for any sign of danger. Routine procedures persisted, yet the storm's growing presence began to intrude on every task. Lifeboats were double-checked, hatches reinforced, and emergency protocols reviewed, a silent acknowledgement that the Atlantic could shift from placid to perilous without warning. These hours marked a delicate equilibrium, where human skill, adherence to procedure, and attention to detail were the only barriers between order and chaos. Technical readings suggested all systems were nominal, yet the ship's motion betrayed a reality more turbulent than the instruments could convey. Each swell lifted the vessel differently, imposing stress on the hull and cargo tanks that engineering logs could quantify only partially. Electrical systems remained stable, yet small jolts travelled through pipelines and machinery, imperceptible in some contexts but telling to those familiar with shipboard vibrations. The contradiction between measured normalcy and physical experience added layers of uncertainty, a signal that would soon culminate in the vessel's last known communications. Radio communications began to show interference, brief bursts of static punctuating otherwise routine updates, hinting at the mounting peril. Operators on shore and nearby vessels noted interrupted transmissions, repeated call signs, and truncated position reports. Each fragment offered only partial insight. The crew was struggling, attempting to convey location and condition under increasingly difficult circumstances. Analysts would later scrutinize these fragments, noting patterns that suggested both urgency and methodical effort, a human attempt to maintain contact as conditions deteriorated rapidly. The hurricane's full force approached, waves rising and wind intensifying, testing both vessel and crew beyond ordinary expectations. The sea became a shifting labyrinth of foam and swells, currents intersecting unpredictably with the ship's forward motion. Deck crews faced relentless spray and gusts that made simple tasks hazardous. The ship, though engineered to withstand storms, now confronted forces exceeding routine design assumptions. Even minor misalignments in cargo stability or navigational corrections could have cascading effects, further complicating an already perilous situation. Amid the tempest, the SSL Faro transmitted its final fragments of communication, incomplete, urgent, and hauntingly human. The signals, distorted by wind, rain, and atmospheric interference, conveyed only partial locations and fragmented status reports. Each burst reflected the crew's attempt to assert control, to document position, to call for aid. The messages ended abruptly, leaving nothing but the echo of effort and the unspoken severity of the storm. For investigators, these fragments became the only tangible witness to a catastrophic sequence that unfolded entirely out of reach. Search operations spanned miles of ocean in the aftermath, yet the storm's remnants and shifting currents left no tangible trace of the ship. Coast Guard cutters, commercial vessels, and aerial reconnaissance combed the predicted zones, following drift projections and examining areas where floating debris might appear. Despite this meticulous effort, the Atlantic yielded nothing. No lifeboats, containers, or hull fragments. The absence of recoverable material lent an almost mythic quality to the disappearance, emphasizing the vastness and unpredictability of the ocean in extreme conditions. The archived transmissions and meticulous logs became the only surviving evidence, a window into the crew's struggle against nature's overwhelming power. Investigators studied engine hours, navigational charts, and weather data, juxtaposing them against the hurricane's known intensity. Every fragment, every entry provided hints but no certainty. Human resilience, shipboard engineering, and environmental chaos intersected in a moment that left nothing behind but partial signals. These remnants, technical and human alike, crystallized the enduring enigma, a vessel vanishing in a storm recorded in fragments of voice, data, and imagination. The SSL Faro's hurricane transmissions vanished into the storm's roar, a fleeting trace of resolve and human vigilance swallowed by the ocean's indifferent power. The Revenox Unanswered Mayday. Morning light spilled across the restless Atlantic as the Revenox maintained its plotted course, the ship's engines cutting through waves that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The vessel had departed from its home port on a standard coastal run, its manifest and navigational plans logged with precision. On board, the crew expected routine weather patterns, standard ocean currents, and familiar shipping lanes. Yet the Atlantic, even on a seemingly tranquil morning, concealed subtleties. Shifting microcurrents, the gradual build of wind and water density variations that could influence a large tanker in ways undetectable to the naked eye. These imperceptible factors would later form part of the puzzle surrounding the final call for assistance. On the bridge, the captain and officers moved with deliberate precision, scanning instruments and charts, unaware that the routine voyage would soon spiral into uncertainty. Their movements reflected years of experience, coordinating steering, speed adjustments, and course plotting. Observations of the horizon were routine, aided by radar that scanned for obstacles, nearby ships, and irregular weather patterns. Communication schedules with coastal authorities were meticulously followed, yet the human element, senses trained to detect anomaly, was the only line of defense against the unseen, a fragile barrier against the inexplicable forces that the Atlantic might conceal. Within the hold, cargo containers sat secured and temperature-controlled, their contents monitored with meticulous attention to avoid the slightest imbalance. The Revenox carried a mix of commercial and industrial freight, each item catalogued in detailed manifests. Pumps and sensors maintained internal conditions, ensuring temperature and humidity remained within safe parameters. Even minor shifts in the hold's weight distribution or vibrations from the engines could affect stability. Though nothing in the logs indicated immediate concern, investigators later noted that any subtle disruption to the carefully regulated cargo could have been catastrophic under the right circumstances, creating a hidden vulnerability in a seemingly controlled voyage. Subtle shifts in humidity and a barely perceptible swell in the waves went largely unnoticed, yet they hinted at conditions the crew would later struggle to explain. The Atlantic surface can mask significant subsurface movement, with currents and swells forming patterns invisible from deck level. Oceanographers analysing the area of the Revenox disappearance later noted the presence of intersecting currents and minor thermoclines, natural phenomena that can subtly affect a vessel's heading and balance. Mariners understand that such forces rarely announce themselves, yet their effects, compounded by human miscalculation or equipment calibration, may amplify over hours, leaving a ship caught in circumstances beyond its crew's immediate perception. Navigation systems briefly flagged minor discrepancies, prompting repeated checks, though nothing suggested an imminent threat to the vessel's progress. These alerts, often dismissed as calibration errors or minor drift corrections, were recorded in the ship's logs without alarm. The bridge crew dutifully adjusted headings, verified GPS data, and confirmed waypoint coordinates, all standard procedure. Yet the fragmentary nature of these early anomalies would later be re-examined with the weight of hindsight, suggesting that even small inconsistencies in instrumentation might signal forces imperceptible to both technology and human senses. Only through radio logs would the vessel's final mayday emerge, a stuttering and incomplete signal that left investigators piecing together fragments of a desperate call. The transmission was brief, interrupted by static and unintelligible syllables. Shore-based operators captured the last coherent phrases. words hinting at distress, a location, and the ship's name, but the message abruptly ended. No subsequent communications were received, no signal repeated, leaving authorities with a haunting fragment that could not be fully interpreted. This incomplete broadcast became the only tangible evidence of a sudden event that would erase the Revenox from observation. Mechanical gauges continued to report stability, masking the urgency implied in the broken transmission and underscoring the gap between perception and measurement. Engine performance, fuel flow, and hydraulic systems all remained within normal parameters. Electrical diagnostics revealed no anomalies, and pressure readings throughout the hull suggested structural integrity was uncompromised. Yet the contradiction between these readings and the urgency in the transmitted Mayday created a chilling puzzle for investigators. A vessel appearing technically sound while its crew experienced a threat severe enough to prompt a final call. Engine room reports confirmed consistent performance across all systems, revealing no anomalies that could have triggered the crew's distress. Engineers logged RPMs, fuel efficiency and auxiliary systems, all showing routine behaviour. Pumps circulated ballast water, stabilising the vessel, while generators maintained electrical output without interruption. Yet even as the mechanical heartbeat of the ship remained steady, the human perception of imminent danger, or environmental conditions invisible to instruments, drove the crew to attempt a Mayday. This dichotomy would become central to understanding the mystery surrounding the Revenox, highlighting the ocean's capacity to overwhelm even the most robust vessel in ways that defy conventional measurement. Search operations deployed swiftly, covering hundreds of square miles, yet the Revenox left no debris, its disappearance baffling even the most experienced rescuers. Coast Guard cutters, naval patrols and aerial reconnaissance were coordinated along the vessel's intended course. Thermal imaging, radar sweeps and drifting pattern simulations were employed to predict possible locations. Despite these extensive efforts, no life rafts, containers or wreckage were sighted. The absence of material evidence intensified the sense of inexplicable loss, framing the Revenox vanishing as an event that existed only in incomplete communications and meticulous, yet ultimately insufficient voyage logs. Investigators debated sudden structural compromise, rogue waves or internal failures, yet each theory remained unconfirmed in the absence of tangible evidence. Structural stress, hull fatigue or sudden cargo shifts were considered, with technical manuals consulted for precedent. Oceanic phenomena, including microbursts, whirlpools or sudden current reversals, were explored as potential contributors. Even human error or navigational misjudgment was discussed, yet all remained speculative. No conclusive proof could connect the broken Mayday to a physical cause, and no remnants of the vessel were recovered to confirm any theory. The Revenox's fate joined a lineage of unresolved Atlantic vanishings, its Mayday echoing in waters already marked by decades of similar maritime enigmas. Historians and maritime specialists placed this disappearance alongside other Bermuda Triangle incidents, noting recurring patterns, abrupt loss of communication, absence of wreckage, and the enduring presence of unexplained environmental variables. The repetition of these elements across decades of nautical history reinforced the area's reputation as a zone where the ordinary rules of observation seemed to falter, leaving even highly trained crews vulnerable to sudden, unrecoverable events. The broken fragments of the final call persisted in recordings, a haunting trace of human urgency swallowed by the indifferent sea. For decades, these fragments would be analysed, reinterpreted, and studied with advancing technology, yet they revealed only what was already evident. A vessel, its crew, and their intentions were abruptly erased from the tangible world. Scholars and technical investigators alike would return to these audio traces, attempting to decipher what may have been overlooked, yet the result remained the same, a fleeting human voice, suspended in uncertainty. Reconciliation of precise logs with the interrupted SOS challenged every assumption, leaving analysts to confront the ocean's capacity for vanishing what seemed stable and controlled. Cross-referencing navigational data, engine metrics, and environmental conditions suggested no definitive explanation for the urgency captured in the Mayday. Despite careful simulation of currents, cargo movement, and potential weather anomalies, the final moments remained unknowable. The Revenox, recorded in meticulous detail for much of its voyage, dissolved into silence, its disappearance a testament to the limits of human observation in the face of the Atlantic's immensity. The Revenox Mayday remains a ghostly whisper in the Atlantic, a single call unanswered, echoing long after the vessel itself vanished from sight. The Carol A. Deering's silent distress. The harbour faded from view as the Carol A. Deering set out, her departure marked by nothing more than routine signals that would later contrast starkly with the silence that followed. Pilings creaked under the morning tide, gulls wheeled above the calm waters, and the ship's wake traced a bright line toward the horizon. The crew, seasoned by years at sea, exchanged brief nods over daily duties, unaware that a journey intended as ordinary would soon become one of the most enduring maritime enigmas of the Bermuda Triangle. Every line secured, every sail unfurled, suggested a voyage entirely predictable, yet history would remember it for what remained unseen. Charts and logs promised a familiar route along the Atlantic coastline, yet the empty horizon offered no indication of the unusual events about to unfold. Mariners consulting navigation charts would have recognized familiar bends and currents, the Gulf Stream's powerful pull and the shoals that had claimed vessels in centuries past. The sea appeared placid, but the region's reputation for sudden shifts and localized anomalies whispered a caution that no instrument or logbook could fully convey. The path seemed secure, yet the Deering's ultimate fate would reveal that even the most predictable course could conceal mysteries below the surface. Hands that had guided the vessel for countless voyages moved with trained efficiency, unaware that the routine would soon fracture into unanswered calls. Sailors adjusted lines, checked rigging, and plotted positions with near-automatic precision. Their familiarity with the vessel's 5 masts, rigging and deck layout allowed them to operate almost instinctively, a ballet of skill and habit. Yet, in the hours following departure, the same crew whose expertise ensured countless successful journeys would become part of a narrative defined by absence, their actions recorded only in routine logs and the faint echoes of a final distress signal. Within the hold, cargo compartments were carefully secured, their meticulous arrangement offering no hint of the unknown forces that might later compromise the ship's integrity. Coal and lumber were stacked to maintain balance, with braces and bulkheads minimizing movement during transit. Temperature and humidity were monitored indirectly by the crew, though no extraordinary measures were required for a standard load. The ship's stability relied on the careful attention of these arrangements, a diligence that ultimately could not anticipate invisible forces, currents, waves, or atmospheric phenomena that might affect the vessel far from the coast. Routine position reports were transmitted without delay, yet the static that occasionally marred these communications would become the only trace of impending mystery. Shore-based operators recorded each transmission with methodical care, noting the vessel's headings, speed, and any minor course adjustments. At first, any distortion seemed trivial, the occasional interruption of a signal common in coastal operations. In hindsight, however, these slight anomalies represented the only threads connecting the world to a ship soon to vanish, a fragile chain broken before it could convey meaning or urgency. Crew rotations maintained a steady vigilance over sails, rigging, and navigational instruments, preserving the outward appearance of normal operations even as the unexplainable began to stir. Lookouts scanned the horizon for other vessels and shifting weather patterns, while officers verified compass readings and celestial navigation fixes. The outward calm suggested nothing amiss, yet invisible environmental factors, the subtle tug of a rogue current, localized pressure changes, or the sudden rise of an unseen swell may have introduced instability that only the crew sensed, prompting a distress signal that would never reach completion. The logbook recorded headings and speed with methodical precision, yet when, compared to later analysis, subtle inconsistencies emerged that would puzzle investigators for decades. Distances between waypoints appeared accurate, and daily entries reflected careful attention to both environmental and mechanical details. But reconstructed positions and drift patterns indicated slight deviations, anomalies that could not be fully explained by tides, currents, or human error alone. These discrepancies formed a puzzle that highlighted the fragility of even the most carefully maintained data when confronted with the unknown. Previous records reveal that the waters traversed by the Carol A. Deering had long been noted for peculiar occurrences that confounded mariners. Sailors in earlier decades reported fleeting lights on the horizon, abrupt shifts in current, and instruments that occasionally registered inexplicable deviations from compass readings. While none of these incidents left tangible evidence, their accumulation in navigational logs suggests that the North Atlantic corridor off Cape Hatteras carried subtle hazards invisible to the eye. Such patterns, often dismissed as anecdotal, gain weight when paired with the Deering's vanishing, offering context for the fragmented and unanswered distress signals that remain the sole testament to her final voyage. Atmospheric readings suggested no cause for alarm, but hidden currents and shifting tides could have introduced hazards invisible to both instruments and the human eye. Barometers, wind gauges, and temperature readings showed mild conditions, yet the North Atlantic is notorious for localized disturbances that leave no lasting trace on standard equipment. A sudden upwelling or concentrated eddy could subtly alter the vessel's course, or produce turbulence sufficient to affect cargo balance. Investigators later recognized that ordinary readings could mask extraordinary risk, offering no assurance that a ship could safely navigate the waters despite appearances. Nearby vessels reported nothing unusual, their proximity highlighting the eeriness of the Deering's vanishing presence and the absence of any conventional explanation. Logs from passing schooners and freighters noted no unusual waves, weather changes, or sightings of the Deering outside her last reported coordinates. The contrast between observed normalcy and the ship's eventual disappearance deepened the mystery, reinforcing the notion that maritime hazards are not always visible or predictable. In this emptiness, the sea itself seemed to obscure both cause and consequence. Attempts to reach the ship over radio frequencies produced fragmented responses, brief bursts that suggested urgency without providing clarity or actionable coordinates. Operators recorded static-laden syllables and partial phrases, attempts at communication that offered no actionable guidance. The lack of coherent messaging created both procedural frustration and historical intrigue, as the ship's last efforts to signal for help were reduced to incomplete echoes. These fragments remain the sole auditory trace of human intervention during the moments preceding the vessel's disappearance. Investigators scrutinized mechanical systems, hull integrity, and cargo safety, yet each parameter appeared flawless, deepening the contradiction between operational normalcy and the mysterious distress. Structural inspections noted no evidence of hull breach, rigging failure, or mechanical malfunction, while cargo configuration adhered to recommended safety standards. The absence of physical indicators for catastrophe forced researchers to consider less tangible explanations: rogue environmental conditions, navigational anomalies, or sudden human misjudgment. Each scenario lacked confirmation, reinforcing the vessel's placement in maritime legend rather than recorded disaster. Speculation ranged from sudden weather phenomena to navigational anomalies, yet the absence of corroborating evidence ensured that every theory remained provisional, hanging between possibility and uncertainty. Scholars and investigators debated the potential role of waterspouts, microbursts, or atmospheric interference, alongside considerations of navigational error or compass deviation. While historical precedent offered analogous scenarios, none precisely matched the Carol AA. Deering's final circumstances, each theory remains a hypothesis, contributing to enduring curiosity without delivering resolution. The final moments of the Carol A. Deering exist only in fragments of logs, brief transmissions, and the questions left unanswered by a vessel that disappeared without a trace. Every detail, from crew vigilance to precise cargo management, underscores the contrast between preparation and fate. These remnants serve as reminders of the vulnerability inherent in seafaring life, where even experienced hands and meticulous planning can be rendered powerless by forces unseen, unrecorded, and unexplainable. The ship's silent distress lingered in maritime memory, a riddle that the ocean has never fully revealed. The Globemaster's final weather report. Above the Atlantic, the Globemaster maintained a steady altitude, its flight routine unremarkable except for a transmission that would become the last trace of its journey. The aircraft, tasked with standard reconnaissance and cargo transport, had departed under clear skies and predictable currents, its crew relying on protocols honed through countless flights. Yet a single incomplete report would transform the mission from routine operation into one of the most confounding unsolved cases of the Bermuda Triangle, leaving investigators decades later to pass fragmentary weather observations as the only hint of what occurred. The flight crew meticulously logged wind direction, barometric readings, and cloud formations, their instruments painting a picture of conditions that seemed ordinary at the time. Each measurement was taken at scheduled intervals, cross-checked against historical patterns, and transmitted periodically to the monitoring station. Despite their precision, the seeming normalcy of the data would later deepen the mystery. The aircraft was fully operational, the crew experienced no apparent distress, and yet the final signal would carry an undertone of urgency that no observer could fully interpret. Subtle deviations in pressure readings and minor turbulence prompted notes in the log, details that would later appear significant in reconstructing the aircraft's final moments. The altimeter oscillated in ways barely perceptible but recorded with habitual thoroughness. Pilots noted variations in air density that could indicate microclimatic disturbances, while routine adjustments were made to compensate. In hindsight, these minor anomalies suggested that even the most routine observations might contain hidden clues, fragments of an invisible chain of events that would ultimately end in silence. Unusually low-level cloud formations appeared on radar readings, creating pockets of localized turbulence that the crew noted with quiet attention. These formations, though minor, sometimes cause sudden pressure shifts detectable by altimeters and sensitive instruments. Meteorologists reviewing the logs later suggested that microbursts or rapidly shifting stratocumulus layers could produce effects strong enough to interfere with flight paths while leaving little trace on standard weather reports. The Globemaster's instruments recorded these fleeting irregularities, but without corroborating visual evidence, their significance remained a subtle hint in an otherwise ordinary flight, an understated precursor to the vanishing that would follow. Standard radio checks were completed on schedule, each message confirming the flight's position, with no hint that the routine report would become a final record. The communications included coordinates, headings, and estimated times for successive checkpoints, all transmitted with the clarity expected of trained operators. The final messages, however, arrived partially obscured by static, hinting at interference that would forever remain unexplained. For those monitoring the frequencies, the routine signals masked an undercurrent of unresolved tension, a prelude to an incomprehensible disappearance. Static and brief interruptions began to creep into transmissions, fragmenting coordinates and weather data in ways that puzzled operators monitoring the frequencies. Words cut off mid-sentence, syllables repeated, and numerical readings occasionally blurred into noise. Technicians meticulously logged each interruption, yet no cause, mechanical, environmental, or otherwise, could be confirmed. These disruptions became the sole record of the aircraft's final condition, leaving only questions as to whether they signaled a sudden atmospheric anomaly, equipment failure, or some other unmeasurable force. Altimeter, radar, and onboard diagnostic systems all reported normal function, emphasizing the discrepancy between apparent operational stability and the incomplete communication that followed. Engines ran within standard parameters, electrical systems showed no irregularities, and flight controls remained responsive. Every instrument indicated routine performance, yet the transmission's fragmentary nature contradicted the data. Analysts would later note that the absence of mechanical warning signs highlighted the possibility that whatever befell the Globemaster eluded both human and technological detection. The crew observed fleeting changes in cloud shadows and sudden gusts of wind, atmospheric phenomena familiar to seasoned pilots yet unusual enough to merit careful notation. Patches of rapidly shifting cloud cover and localized wind shear might have been overlooked on other flights, but each movement was recorded. These fleeting observations, mundane in isolation, gained significance when juxtaposed with the incomplete nature of the final report. They painted a picture of a sky subtly at odds with expectation, a stage for events that would leave no debris or survivor testimony. Navigation charts indicated no hazardous airspace, yet historical records noted occasional magnetic anomalies in this sector of the Atlantic. Pilots occasionally reported compass deviations during previous flights, small enough to be corrected but significant when reconstructing lost flight paths. While these anomalies could not fully explain the Globemaster's disappearance, analysts considered the possibility that slight disruptions to onboard navigational systems, combined with subtle atmospheric irregularities, may have contributed to the final fragmented weather report. These unseen forces, imperceptible to routine monitoring, underscored the difficulty of interpreting the last transmissions, leaving investigators to balance fact against the unknowable. Adjustments to altitude and heading were performed with precise coordination, reflecting standard protocol for responding to irregular but non-critical weather patterns. Pilots relied on familiar procedures to navigate around turbulence, recalibrating instruments and consulting charts without urgency. While these corrections were consistent with ordinary flight management, they would later underscore the contrast between normal operations and the abrupt cessation of communication, emphasizing the enigma of a disappearance that unfolded without forewarning. The final weather report arrived in fragments, cutting off mid-sentence, offering the only evidence of what the pilots were experiencing before all contact ceased. Partial readings distorted by static included incomplete barometric numbers, truncated wind speeds, and unanchored position references. Shore-based monitoring stations could capture only glimpses of the situation, leaving gaps too large to reconcile. These fragments, transmitted in fleeting bursts, became the sole testament to the aircraft's existence beyond the last confirmed coordinates. Search efforts initiated immediately after the interrupted transmission relied on radar sweeps, flight paths, and extrapolated drift patterns, yet the Globemaster remained invisible. Coast Guard vessels, private craft, and reconnaissance aircraft combed thousands of square miles of the Atlantic, focusing on probable flight corridors. Despite sophisticated sonar and radar, no wreckage, cargo, or personal effects were ever recovered. The thoroughness of the operation only reinforced the anomaly. A fully functional aircraft, complete with an experienced crew, had disappeared without a trace. Investigators later analysed meteorological charts, wind currents, and historical storm activity, attempting to correlate environmental conditions with the abrupt end of communication. Every accessible data point was cross-referenced against the fragments of the weather report. No extreme weather, sudden squall, or documented cyclone coincided with the aircraft's last known position, leaving the team to consider unrecorded microclimates or unseen atmospheric disturbances. Each analytical model highlighted the improbability of such a complete disappearance under conventional meteorological circumstances. Regional records indicated that this section of the Bermuda Triangle had experienced prior unexplained anomalies, lending a chilling resonance to the aircraft's vanishing signal. Previous incidents had involved rapid shifts in instrument readings, temporary radar invisibility, and sudden loss of communications, all unexplained and poorly understood. While these historical events offered no direct evidence, they contextualized the Globemaster's final report within a larger pattern of mysterious maritime and aerial disappearances, reinforcing the persistent aura of the region's unexplained phenomena. All that remained of the Globemaster were its partially transmitted weather observations, a fragmentary echo preserved in logs and radio archives, devoid of wreckage or human testimony. The last data captured hints at conditions the crew faced, but cannot fully convey the sequence of events that led to the disappearance. For researchers, historians, and meteorologists, the case persists as an intersection of verifiable fact and unresolvable mystery, emblematic of the Bermuda Triangle's enduring capacity to absorb certainty and replace it with silence. The aircraft's last weather report lingers in memory and record alike, a silent testament to an unseen force that claimed both message and messenger. The Southern District's last known contact. The morning sky over the western Atlantic held a muted grey light on December 5, 1954, when the Southern District sent what would become her last known communication. A routine radio message from this bulk carrier, carrying a heavy load of sulphur from Port Sulphur, Louisiana to Bucksport, Maine, marked the final trace of her existence. Built as a Navy LST during World War II and later converted for commercial service, the ship was ordinary in design, yet extraordinary in the silence that followed her final transmission. That routine report would become the only evidence that she had crossed into the unknown waters of the Bermuda Triangle. The message itself was brief and unremarkable, noting course, speed, and the ship's steady progress. It contained no hint of danger, no signal that conditions might prove fatal. The officers aboard reported normal engine performance, routine position updates, and calm compliance with maritime protocol. Such reports were commonplace, forming the backdrop of mid-century Atlantic shipping, but in this instance the normalcy became chilling. It was a final assertion of life in the midst of a route that would soon erase every trace of vessel and crew, leaving a haunting void where words should have continued. Nearby vessels that day observed the Southern Districts as she pressed northward through the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Keys, another cargo ship, noted her passing off the Florida coast without any indication of difficulty. On board the Gulf Keys, crewmen saw a ship progressing normally, hull intact, deck clear of visible damage, yet in mere hours she vanished from the world. The gap between her routine radio message and the onset of silence was infinitesimal in measured time, but infinite in consequence, leaving the Gulf Stream and surrounding waters as the last stage of her existence. Weather conditions that day were variable but increasingly severe. Winds from the southeast built to force 7, later shifting to the north at force 8, producing swells that challenged even sturdy vessels. Rain squalls reduced visibility and increased the instability of the sea's surface, forcing ships to adjust course and reduce speed. Although experienced mariners would have known to expect such conditions, a cargo-laden ship of her type would have been particularly vulnerable to sudden movement or rolling. These forces may have contributed to her disappearance, yet no direct evidence points to a precise mechanism that overtook the vessel. After the last radio transmission at approximately 1350 hours, no further signals emerged from the southern districts. She issued no distress call, no emergency code, and no fragmented report of malfunction or structural failure. Her silence, following a routine acknowledgement of her position and condition, became profoundly unsettling. A ship sending routine reports normally signals predictable progression, yet the disappearance that followed erased every expectation. What should have been the next transmission, scheduled within hours, never arrived, leaving only a spectral trace of her route and a haunting reminder of the ocean's capacity for sudden, unexplained erasure. Owners and operators initially attributed the delay to weather or navigational slowdowns. Expectations held that the ship would arrive in Bucksport on schedule, and routine delays were not unusual in winter Atlantic crossings. When no contact came by December 9th, concern escalated, prompting attempts to reach her by radio. 2 days later, the situation was formally reported to the United States Coast Guard. Air and sea searches were launched, extending over several days, yet these efforts yielded no sign of the ship, no flotsam or fragments, and no trace of crew. The absence of evidence magnified the mystery surrounding her final transmission. The search returned nothing of significance. Neither debris nor life rafts were located, and no survivors came forward. For a vessel carrying over 20 crew members, this total disappearance defied typical maritime expectations. In ordinary circumstances, storms or structural failures scatter floating wreckage that can be traced. Here, the southern districts left nothing but silence. The void that followed her last routine message emphasized the extremity of her fate, and investigators were left with only the certainty of loss, unaccompanied by insight into how or why a ship that should have completed a routine voyage vanished without a trace. Several weeks later, a single life buoy marked the only physical confirmation of her presence. Spotted by a passing vessel, the buoy bore her name in bold black letters, stark against the winter grey of the Atlantic. It floated alone in the currents, unaccompanied by other wreckage or cargo. This isolated artifact offered a chilling hint at the vessel's fate, yet only deepened the mystery. How could a ship so entirely consumed leave a single trace? The buoy suggested rapid submersion or disintegration, but no conclusions could be drawn with certainty. It stood as a solitary testament to a voyage erased. The Coast Guard investigation concluded only that the southern districts had suffered a maritime casualty, a term that encompasses everything from foundering in heavy seas to structural failure or unforeseen hazards. Without debris or survivors, no cause could be definitively established. The language of the report acknowledged death and loss while leaving every detail of the disappearance unresolved. The official record confirmed that she never reached her destination, yet it did not explain the utter absence of wreckage or the lack of emergency signals, highlighting the perplexing completeness of her vanishing. Over time, the southern districts became emblematic of the Bermuda Triangle's enduring mysteries. Her story is occasionally cited alongside other vessels and aircraft lost in the same region, part of a larger narrative of sudden disappearance. As decades passed, speculation grew about the forces capable of claiming a routine cargo ship so completely. Ocean currents, storms, and navigational hazards were suggested, yet none explained the total erasure between her last communication and the void that followed. In maritime circles, her final routine message remains a haunting timestamp of life that abruptly ended. The route she followed, threading through the Gulf Stream and unpredictable Atlantic weather, is notorious among mariners for sudden squalls and treacherous currents. Ships navigating these waters are at the mercy of both natural forces and unseen underwater hazards, making survival uncertain even under ideal circumstances. Yet the Southern Districts transmitted nothing beyond her routine report, leaving observers and authorities with a record of ordinary life abruptly severed. No signal ever indicated distress or deviation from course, and no anomalies were reported by vessels passing nearby. The Atlantic kept its silence, leaving the truth submerged. The silence after her final transmission is remarkable for its completeness. Unlike many maritime disappearances, where partial communication or fragmentary debris offers investigators a starting point, the Southern Districts left only a timestamp of existence before vanishing. Every detail known, the cargo, the crew, the date, the last coordinates, is overshadowed by absence. The routine message, ordinary in tone and content, became extraordinary in retrospect, marking the last signal before the ship was claimed entirely by the sea. It is this abrupt transition from life to silence that anchors the ship's story within the lore of unexplained Atlantic disappearances. Even decades later, the Southern Districts occupies a spectral position in records of Bermuda Triangle vanishings. It is remembered as a ship whose ordinary routine became extraordinary in its absence, whose last known contact remains a solitary echo across the Atlantic. The crew, the vessel and the voyage are all preserved in history only by the final radio message. Brief, calm, and unremarkable, yet haunting precisely because no further word was ever transmitted. The simplicity of that message and the extremity of its consequence create a tension between known facts and unknowable outcomes, a silence impossible to explain fully. The ocean claimed the Southern Districts with no warning, leaving only a fleeting trace of life and a lingering question about her disappearance. Her final communication is the enduring evidence of existence abruptly erased, an unresolved signal that reminds every listener of the ocean's power and mystery. In the depths of that Atlantic stretch, her final words remain unanswered. The Anita's cargo and final transmission. Grey waves stretched endlessly under a sky veiled in mist, each swell moving with quiet persistence as the Anita forged northward, her bulk iron ore cargo pressing down on a deck that gleamed wet in the early winter light. The sea's rhythm was hypnotic, the horizon a soft blur between water and cloud. Seagulls wheeled overhead, calling in sharp bursts, and the cold tang of salt clung to the bridge. For those aboard, the morning seemed routine, yet beneath the surface of these familiar waters lay a corridor of currents and eddies that would soon make the ordinary extraordinary. Below deck, the routine of the crew continued with mechanical precision, engineers adjusting pressures and watch officers scanning gauges, unaware that every ordinary task would soon become their last recorded act. The hum of engines, punctuated by the metallic clink of levers and valves, formed a steady background to the officers' careful notes in logbooks. In the galley, a cook prepared the midday meal, the aroma of stew mixing faintly with diesel oil. Every hand moved with practiced familiarity, each action marking the invisible rhythm of a ship long accustomed to traversing the Atlantic without incident. The iron ore rested in enormous holds, dense and immovable, a silent presence whose weight shaped the ship's stability and would test the vessel's endurance as currents tugged from unexpected angles. The ore had been loaded with care, distributed evenly to maintain balance, yet its sheer mass created inertia that could shift unpredictably when struck by large waves. Even minor tilting might strain the hull and affect navigational controls, an ever-present risk for vessels carrying such heavy material. Crew members, aware of the cargo's significance, monitored the ship's movements and ballast, but no reading or indicator foreshadowed the anomaly that would later erase all traces of the voyage. Maps and charts detailed the course across the Atlantic, a line of ink tracing familiar maritime corridors, yet beneath the plotted path, unseen currents and sudden weather shifts quietly demanded respect. The Gulf Stream's powerful current pressed northward, intersecting with other streams and eddies that could nudge a vessel off course in hours. Islands and shoals lay far from the Anita's route, yet the ocean itself, moving into invisible patterns, introduced subtle hazards that could catch even experienced navigators unaware. Every decision on course and speed had to anticipate these forces, yet in December, the unpredictable nature of storms added a layer of uncertainty. A low mist rolled over the water, softening the horizon while distant squalls gathered along the Gulf Stream, hinting at the volatility hidden within waters that seemed deceptively calm from the bridge. The wind tugged intermittently at the rigging, and waves lapped with a rhythm that suggested both lull and menace. Visibility dropped in the haze, obscuring distant ships and subtle swells alike. The crew remained vigilant, eyes tracing the line between sea and sky, instruments checked regularly, the monotony of repetition underscored by the ocean's persistent mutter. In these conditions, routine became fragile, a thin barrier between order and the unknown. Engines hummed and auxiliary pumps clicked into rhythm, the ship's systems monitored in steady repetition, each reading normal, each control functioning as expected under the practiced hands of her crew. Pressure gauges reflected uniformity, bilges drained steadily, and radar, limited by 1950s technology, showed only the expanse of water ahead. Even as minor adjustments were made for wave action, no mechanical irregularity raised concern. The Anita moved as designed, a vessel both robust and familiar, yet the ocean held variables beyond human measurement, silent forces capable of undermining a routine voyage in ways that would never be recorded or observed. Officers moved between stations, marking progress, plotting coordinates, and noting the subtle roll of the ship, each awareness of the ocean's sway recorded in logs that would later become silent relics. Watches rotated on precise schedules, crewmen tracing compass headings and verifying positions against charts. Daily rituals, engine checks, course recalibrations and soundings continued uninterrupted. Each observation, once mundane, now gained significance in retrospect, a record of normalcy immediately preceding disappearance. The rhythm of human activity, precise and deliberate, contrasted with the ocean's unpredictable undertow, creating a tension invisible yet profoundly consequential. Even as the vessel maintained her course, small anomalies, the shifting of oar in the holds, a slight increase in swell went unremarked, unnoticed indicators that would frame the final moments of recorded life aboard. These subtle perturbations, imperceptible amid the daily routine, could influence the ship's handling in critical ways. Engineers logged nothing irregular, officers saw only standard metrics, and the crew experienced no immediate alarm. Yet the interplay between weight, wave, and current set the stage for events that would soon transform the ordinary passage into one of the Bermuda Triangle's enduring mysteries. Only after the day had progressed did the radio operator make the brief, routine communication, noting position and condition, an ordinary message that would become the last human voice from the Anita before all contact ceased. The message was calm, professional, and measured, reporting coordinates and engine status in accordance with maritime procedure. Shore stations acknowledged the transmission, anticipating follow-ups that never arrived. In hindsight, the simplicity of the message is chilling. It provides the only direct connection to the vessel, the crew, and their final presence on the Atlantic, a moment that marks the threshold between observation and total absence. Receiving stations logged the broadcast with customary acknowledgement, anticipating updates that never arrived, and for the first time, the absence of further transmissions began to suggest the extraordinary. Messages sent to follow the routine protocol went unanswered, and attempts to reach the vessel by voice or Morse code revealed only static. Nearby ships reported nothing unusual during their crossings of the same route. Silence replaced expectation, and the ocean, previously a backdrop to ordinary operations, now assumed a presence that was impossible to define, an active participant in the narrative of disappearance that would remain unsolved. Searches uncovered nothing, no lifeboats, wreckage, or oil slicks, an almost impossible void that made the vessel's disappearance into mystery absolute and immediate in its finality. Aircraft scoured the waves, surface vessels combed the areas indicated by her last coordinates, yet no debris marked the path the Anita had travelled. The absence of physical evidence confounded investigators, who expected at least fragments of hull, cargo, or personal effects. The stark completeness of her vanishing intensified the sense of suspense, leaving only the knowledge that the last transmitted signal existed, a tether to a crew whose fate remained entirely unknown. This disappearance joined a growing register of vessels lost in the same Atlantic corridor, reinforcing the enigmatic pattern of unexplained vanishings without ever providing a unifying explanation. Historians and mariners alike catalogue these incidents as anomalies, each occurrence amplifying questions rather than offering answers. Currents, weather, and maritime hazards are often cited, yet none can account for the total absence of traceable evidence. The Anita's final voyage, recorded in charts, logs, and a single radio transmission, now occupies a liminal space where fact, conjecture, and mystery intersect without resolution. Logs, coordinates, and the solitary final transmission remain the only threads connecting ship and crew to a voyage erased, leaving the Atlantic as both stage and enigma. Every prior report, gauge reading, and notation now assumes a new gravity, underscoring the suddenness with which routine life at sea can vanish. Each fragment of information forms a lattice of certainty and uncertainty, a network that points to absence rather than clarity. The Atlantic corridor retains its secrets, and the Anita's story persists as a silent challenge to understanding, a record defined entirely by what remains unspoken and unseen. Somewhere beyond observation, the Anita's last transmission drifts unclaimed, a solitary voice in waters that keep their truth submerged. The KB-50 tanker's interrupted signal. The engines vibrated steadily, a measured hum that threaded through the cabin as the KB-50 navigated invisible currents over a grey, shifting Atlantic that offered no landmarks. Each gauge and dial confirmed normal performance, yet the vastness below reminded the crew of their isolation in the sky. The air was dense with the smell of fuel and metal, instruments ticking in precise rhythm. Outside, clouds stretched unevenly, their forms shifting with the wind, hinting at turbulence that might appear without warning. Every movement of the aircraft, every subtle tilt of the fuselage, was an interaction with forces both predictable and unknowable. Hands moved deftly over panels and throttles, the crew executing routines with a calm born of training, each motion precise, rehearsed, and essential to the mission's meticulous flow. Officers rotated between navigation, engine monitoring, and communication checks, eyes flicking constantly to instruments and dials. Even minor fluctuations in pressure or fuel flow were noted, logged, and assessed. The officer's rhythm was silent, mechanical, and rehearsed, each action an exercise in repetition that created both reassurance and the illusion of complete control. In these moments, the crew embodied the delicate balance between human skill and mechanical reliability. Steel arms extended from the tanker, ready to link with waiting aircraft, every mechanical movement synchronized with the invisible choreography of speed, altitude, and distance that governed mid-air refueling. Crew members calculated angles, speeds, and throttle adjustments with practiced precision. The receiving aircraft approached carefully, and each motion had to coincide with the tanker's steady path. The slightest misalignment could have catastrophic consequences, yet every procedure ran smoothly, a demonstration of coordination honed through repeated drills. Beneath the calm professionalism, invisible variables, the wind, turbulence, and shifting air currents, loomed as silent threats to the operation, their influence unnoticed until disruption arrived. A thin veil of haze muted the horizon, while subtle gusts rippled across the fuselage, reminding the crew that even routine operations could be influenced by unseen atmospheric shifts. From the cockpit, cloud layers appeared almost static, yet radar hinted at movement in higher altitudes. Turbulence, though minor, caused micro-adjustments to maintain steady flight. The air itself seemed to carry tension, compressing sound and light in ways that altered perception. While the crew relied on instruments and visual cues, the environment demanded constant attention, its invisible influence a silent actor in a performance the humans sought to control but could never fully master. Lights blinked across the instrument panels, altimeters and compasses reading stable, radar sweeping the expanse, each measurement reinforcing the illusion of predictability in a vast and indifferent sky. Systems functioned without irregularity, engines purred with mechanical consistency. Navigational checks aligned precisely with charts, and communications were routine. The cockpit's glow reflected off polished surfaces, emphasizing the contrast between controlled human order and the uncertainty of the atmosphere surrounding the aircraft. For the crew, the day was ordinary, filled with calculated tasks and measured responses, yet the Atlantic below held currents, drafts, and turbulence invisible to the instruments, hints of forces that would soon interrupt the apparent normalcy. Eyes traced every needle and gauge, listening to the low murmur of engines, noting vibrations that seemed ordinary, yet in retrospect hinted at the fragility of control in the hours ahead. Subtle shifts in air pressure were recorded, minor deviations of instruments noted, and small adjustments made without comment. Crew members discussed fuel consumption and planned timing for the next refueling with casual efficiency, unaware that each check, each measure of routine, would become part of a frozen record. The aircraft's hum filled the space between officers, a rhythm soon to be broken by the imperceptible first signs of a disruption whose consequences were immediate and absolute. A sudden, fleeting crackle pulsed through the radio channels, breaking the rhythm of communication with a signal so brief it might have been dismissed, had it not foreshadowed what followed. Static whispered and swelled momentarily, punctuating the cabin with tension. Officers glanced at one another, instruments rechecked, but readings remained normal. The anomaly seemed insignificant at first, an echo lost amid the ordinary. Yet every previous repetition of routine hinted that this small, transient interference marked the precipice of the extraordinary. The crew continued procedures, unaware that their final transmission was approaching, and that the fragile balance of order and chaos would soon be tested. The last signal arrived, calm and deliberate, recording position and status before cutting off entirely, leaving ground controllers and nearby aircraft with only unanswered silence and static. Coordinates, fuel levels, and mission status were conveyed in a professional and unremarkable tone. Yet the abrupt cessation created a vacuum of certainty. All instruments aboard indicated normal function, but the human connection, the measured voice that tethered the KB-50 to the world, vanished instantly. For those listening from the ground, the sudden absence carried a weight that machines could not convey, an unbroken, immediate disappearance in a corridor of sky that had seemed entirely familiar moments before. Efforts to re-establish contact began instantly, frequencies adjusted, visual sweeps initiated, yet all attempts failed, leaving only silence to mark the tanker's sudden disappearance. Radar operators scrutinized returns, pilots scanned altitudes, and navigators combed through logged coordinates, but no signal emerged. Communication channels, once routine, remained empty. Nearby aircraft adjusted flight paths in case of drift or emergency descent, yet even careful observation yielded no clue. The silence that replaced the final message was complete, immediate, and inexplicable, an absence that transformed the operational certainty of the flight into a chilling void of unanswerable questions. Reconnaissance planes, naval vessels, and support tankers converged on the last reported location, scanning systematically for debris, fuel slicks, or any trace, but the KB-50 had vanished as if it had been erased from the sky. Search patterns expanded outward, meticulously covering every possible mile of air and sea. Pilots reported only waves, clouds, and an endless horizon. Naval teams examined the Atlantic surface for floating evidence of catastrophic failure, yet found nothing. The thoroughness of the response emphasized the absence itself, a space where a large, fully crewed aircraft should have left some mark, reinforcing the mystery that now dominated both air and ocean. Investigators reviewed mechanical logs, fuel distribution, and atmospheric readings, finding all systems normal, leaving no technical explanation for the abrupt termination of the tanker's communication. Engine performance, avionics, and electrical systems showed no irregularities. Flight path calculations aligned with pre-flight planning, and refueling procedures had been executed correctly. Experts in aviation mechanics debated minute possibilities, air pockets, microbursts, or undetected mechanical stress, but the evidence offered nothing concrete. Every recorded system confirmed normal function, making the disappearance of the aircraft and its crew not only unexplained, but a stark contradiction of everything known about flight procedures and operational safety. The incident joined the Bermuda Triangle's growing catalogue of unexplained losses, notable for the precision and completeness with which a trained crew and functioning aircraft disappeared into untraceable space. Analysts compared it with maritime vanishings, noting patterns of sudden absence without debris or prior warning. While each case differed in vehicle type and mission, the result, a total abrupt disappearance, was consistent. The KB-50's last transmission, truncated and unresolved, highlighted the corridor's reputation for sudden, inexplicable events. Even decades later, the flight remains a case study in how order, discipline, and technology can be rendered irrelevant by unknown forces operating within a region steeped in mystery. The truncated final transmission remains the sole testament to the KB-50's last moments, a solitary voice frozen in time above an ocean that swallowed all evidence. Every measurement, every procedural note, and every flight log serves only to emphasize the suddenness of absence. There is no wreckage, no radio echo, no indication of mechanical failure or human error. The aircraft and its crew have become an enduring enigma, their existence recorded solely in that final interrupted call, a haunting reminder of how completely a well-prepared mission can be erased by the unknown. The sky itself seems to cradle that unfinished message, refusing to reveal what became of the tanker or those who sent it. The Driftwood's distress call. The Driftwood rocked gently against a pattern of swells, its small hull cutting through grey-green water while low mist muted the horizon, leaving nothing but a blurred expanse of sea and sky. The crew moved with quiet efficiency, adjusting rigging and checking lines against the subtle pull of the current. Each wave brushed the wooden sides with soft percussion, a rhythm that felt familiar yet unpredictable. The fog dulled every colour and sound, making even routine movements feel exaggerated in scale. The vessel's engines thrummed steadily, anchoring its presence amid the vast shifting Atlantic around it. On deck, the fishermen went about their tasks with practiced calm, hauling nets and securing catch while inhaling the briny tang of seawater and diesel. Lines coiled and uncoiled under skilled hands, eyes scanning the water for fish, distant vessels or shifts in wind and wave. Each crew member performed multiple duties in turn, from navigation checks to equipment maintenance, forming a network of interdependent motions that kept the small vessel running efficiently. Even in routine, the crew remained alert, their senses trained to subtle changes in the environment that could signal danger far beyond their immediate vision. Daily rhythms governed every aspect of the Driftwood's movement. Nets dropped at set intervals, instruments checked for heading and speed, and casual radio chatter maintained a tenuous connection with shore stations. These procedures created a sense of order, almost meditative, as the crew synchronized their actions with one another and the natural rhythm of the sea. Each task was performed deliberately, without haste, the repetition both reassuring and grounding. Outside, the waves whispered against the hull, the wind shifted imperceptibly, and the Atlantic surface suggested motion beyond their control. The ocean's vastness made even minor deviations feel momentous. Clouds gathered in low banks that rolled across the sky like distant silent hills, and gusts twisted the vessel slightly with every swell. From the deck, the horizon appeared endless, merging water and sky into one indistinct grey. Subtle changes in wind direction pushed the Driftwood's bow off course, though minor, and each adjustment required careful attention. Even without visible storms, the crew recognized that the Atlantic held sudden threats invisible from such a small vessel. Every minor anomaly in the swells or wind patterns was a reminder that routine could become perilous without warning, a lesson learned through experience yet never predictable. Every creak of the deck and whisper of the rigging drew attention. The smell of salt mingled with wet wood and machinery oil, and ears picked up on the nuanced sounds of the sea, waves colliding with hull, lines shifting under tension, distant gulls cutting across the grey expanse. The crew moved with quiet alertness, scanning both water and sky. Observing subtle changes, how a line pulled under strain or a deckboard flexed beneath their weight, they assessed conditions continuously. Even familiar motions became measures of potential risk, and the Atlantic's surface seemed to hold secrets in every shadowed swell, unseen yet sensed. A distant thump of water against the hull, a brief flicker in the radio, and a momentary pause in the pattern of waves hinted at irregularity. These small disturbances went unnoticed by some, dismissed as ordinary, but the crew exchanged glances of concern. Instruments and gauges confirmed normal readings, and yet the perception of unease began to grow. The Driftwood's rhythm, its swells, sounds, and minor quirks, was suddenly punctuated by subtle inconsistencies. Nothing overt occurred, but the tension rose imperceptibly, a prelude to events that would soon shatter the ordinary pattern of the day and turn routine into crisis. Conversations shortened as the crew became more vigilant, each action deliberate and precise, every sound and motion scrutinized. The vessel's drift no longer matched expectations, the swell's pattern felt off, and minor deviations in line tension drew attention. a sense of anticipation began to settle over the small deck, as if the Atlantic itself were holding its breath. Eyes scanned the horizon for familiar cues while instruments remained unchanged, adding to the subtle paradox of calm observation and heightened concern. The atmosphere, ordinary minutes before, had shifted toward tension, each crew member acutely aware that their perception might be the only warning before something irreversible occurred. Then came the short, urgent transmission, coordinates, a clipped statement of distress, and an abrupt end that left shore stations and nearby vessels with nothing but static. The voice was measured, professional, and alarmed in equal measure, cutting through the usual background noise of routine maritime communications. No further messages arrived. The brevity of the transmission intensified its impact. It was a single, unbroken human thread reaching out to an indifferent expanse. For those listening, the Driftwood existed for a brief moment in clarity before vanishing. The call itself transformed into the only tangible remnant of the crew's final actions. Coastal radio stations and nearby vessels attempted to respond immediately, broadcasting requests for clarification and repeating the coordinates provided in the brief call. Patrol boats adjusted courses, and other fishing vessels in the vicinity were alerted, yet every approach yielded silence. The radio channels remained empty, the Driftwood seemingly absent from the patterns of sound that usually mapped human presence at sea. Repeated calls emphasized the emptiness of the ocean in that region, a void punctuated only by static, leaving those who searched with the unsettling realization that the vessel and its crew had disappeared from both observation and reach. The Coast Guard and local maritime patrols deployed resources across the region, including small vessels, helicopters, and scanning teams, combing swells for signs of debris or survivors. Patterns of search expanded outward, covering miles of water systematically. Yet no trace of the Driftwood emerged. No wreckage, no floating equipment, no indication of sudden mechanical failure. Every sweep confirmed absence, reinforcing the mystery. Despite methodical effort, the Atlantic offered no answers, and the very thoroughness of the search highlighted the completeness of what had been lost. A small vessel, its crew, and the final moments captured in a single unresolved transmission. Experts later examined possible environmental hazards, shifting currents, hidden sandbars, and sudden squalls that could challenge even a small vessel. Each factor was plausible but offered no definitive explanation for the disappearance. Logs confirmed normal function and prudent handling of the vessel. The ocean, vast and complex, was capable of both subtle and extreme forces, yet none left physical evidence. The Driftwood's loss remains an intersection of ordinary maritime practice and extraordinary vanishing, a testament to the ways the Atlantic can overwhelm both human skill and mechanical reliability while leaving no trace of the event itself. The Driftwood's case became one among many in the Bermuda Triangle's enigmatic record, notable for the brevity of its final call and the absence of tangible evidence. Patterns of disappearance in the area often involved small vessels, sudden distress, and total loss, with only fleeting communications hinting at their fate. Historical analysis emphasizes the consistency of these events. Human action halted abruptly, ordinary environments rendered untraceable, and the Atlantic retained silence where evidence should have been. The Driftwood, like others, remains a stark reminder of how quickly the known can be erased, leaving only fragmented records and unanswered questions. The truncated SOS stands as the only testament to the crew's final efforts, a fragile human imprint against the vast, indifferent Atlantic that swallowed every trace, every check, every careful maneuver, and every observation recorded by the crew now exists only in memory and transmitted fragments. No wreckage, no follow-up signal, and no survivors ever appeared. The Atlantic claimed the vessel entirely, leaving only the haunting echo of a single call that crossed its surface and dissolved into silence, a stark measure of human vulnerability amid a vast, unknowable sea. The Driftwood's final call drifts across the Atlantic, unanswered, as the waves carry only silence where a human voice once reached. The SS Sylvia L. Oser's final report. A faint metallic scent clung to the bridge, mingling with damp salt as crew members checked instruments and annotated the day's log. The officers moved with deliberate precision, monitoring gauges and recording data, while the hum of machinery filled the otherwise quiet vessel. Below, the engine room pulsed with rhythmic energy, pistons and turbines maintaining the constant power required for the journey ahead. Even amid routine operations, there was a subtle awareness of the Atlantic's unpredictable nature, a vast expanse that demanded respect. Each creak of steel and echo across the decks reminded the crew of the fragile line between order and chaos. Cargo holds extended below the steel deck like subterranean chambers, each stacked container bracing against the ship's immense weight as if aware of the journey ahead. Tons of ore and industrial materials filled the compartments, secured meticulously to withstand storms and shifts in ballast. Cranes rested quietly above, ready to lift and lower the massive loads at ports across the Atlantic. Engineers periodically inspected locking mechanisms and hatch seals, confirming that the vessel's interior remained intact despite the stresses of long ocean travel. The sheer scale of the Sylvia L. Oser impressed even veteran sailors, a reminder of human ambition set against the indifference of the sea. Hands moved over controls and hatches, officers inspecting engines, while deckhands adjusted securing lines, a choreography born from years of routine yet carrying the weight of responsibility. Each member of the crew had assigned roles, yet every action required awareness of others' movements, particularly during routine inspections and course adjustments. Orders were delivered calmly, every instruction precise and concise, while casual conversation was replaced by focused attention. The vessel's scale necessitated constant observation, as minor oversights could escalate rapidly under the combined pressures of cargo weight, weather, and open water. Even ordinary procedures carried an unspoken tension born of experience. Cloud shadows stretched across the deck, wind gusts rattled signal flags, and currents pressed against the hull in subtle patterns, demanding careful attention to the ship's heading. Officers on the bridge tracked these variations against charts and compass readings, adjusting rudder and speed as necessary. Even slight deviations prompted discussions about ballast and engine output, ensuring that cargo remained secure and the ship on course. The Atlantic's expanse offered no visual landmarks, and the horizon remained a shifting line of grey. Every small environmental factor, temperature change, wind shift or swell, was measured against routine as the crew balanced confidence in their vessel with respect for the ocean's vast unpredictability. Voices transmitted coordinates, headings and speeds, a rhythmic cadence of maritime protocol that reassured those listening of continuity amid the endless Atlantic. Each radio report maintained a connection to shore stations and other vessels, serving as both record and reassurance. Officers on the bridge noted each response, confirming receipt and accuracy, while deckhands monitored signals for interference or unusual activity. Even routine communication carried weight. A single anomaly could indicate mechanical trouble, navigational error, or environmental threat. The crew's discipline turned repetition into vigilance, and each confirmed transmission reinforced the delicate balance between operational normalcy and the underlying tension of the open sea. Slight fluctuations in gauge readings and minor deviations in heading drew officers' concern, their eyes scanning charts and instruments for inconsistencies that might signal danger. The readings were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet accumulated significance made them impossible to ignore. Conversations became measured and precise, focusing on corrective actions and confirmation of operational integrity. Outside, the ocean's surface remained deceptively calm, but the crew knew that appearances could be misleading. Even a minor misalignment in heading or ballast could escalate quickly in a vessel of such mass, requiring constant vigilance. The tension was quiet but palpable, threaded through every decision on the bridge. Tension threaded the bridge, manifest in concise gestures and exchanged glances as officers weighed the significance of anomalies, balancing caution with confidence in the vessel's resilience. Each officer moved deliberately, adjusting controls or consulting instruments, while keeping watch for changes in the horizon or sea state. The captain conferred quietly with the first officer, both assessing whether adjustments were sufficient to maintain stability. Deckhands observed with subtle awareness, anticipating commands and ensuring that hatches and lines remained secure. The interplay of routine experience and careful observation created a fragile equilibrium, one that could be disrupted suddenly by conditions beyond human control. A brief, urgent transmission erupted over the radio, coordinates, a single word of distress, and sudden silence, leaving distant listeners with only static and unanswered questions. The SOS was precise yet incomplete, halting abruptly as though something interrupted its delivery. Shore stations attempted immediate responses, while nearby vessels monitored the frequency for repetition or clarification. The atmosphere on the bridge shifted instantly. The calm efficiency of prior hours gave way to concern and rapid assessment. Even the largest ships can vanish, but the immediacy of this signal and its abrupt termination magnified the uncertainty, leaving both crew and distant observers with nothing tangible but a fleeting human imprint. Authorities broadcast alerts to nearby vessels and deployed patrols to the reported sector, yet each effort met only empty water and unanswered signals. Air reconnaissance swept the area systematically, while maritime patrols plotted grids across the reported coordinates, confirming the thoroughness of the search. Communication logs were checked and cross-referenced, hoping to capture any subsequent signals or anomalies. Despite these coordinated efforts, the Sylvia L. Oser remained undetected, as if erased from the surface of the Atlantic. Each hour of fruitless searching intensified the mystery, highlighting the vastness of the ocean and its capacity to conceal even the most massive and carefully monitored vessels. Systematic sweeps from sea and air scoured the area for wreckage or floating debris, but the vast Atlantic revealed no trace of the ship, leaving operations inconclusive. Investigators documented every detail of the search, plotting flight paths and ship courses, reviewing environmental data, and consulting maritime experts. Nothing explained the sudden disappearance. Logs from nearby ships and coastal stations contained no clues beyond the initial SOS. Even natural phenomena that could obscure a vessel, dense fog, sudden squalls, or shifting currents, failed to account for the absence of debris or signs of life. The Atlantic's silence was absolute, amplifying the incomprehensible vanishing. Engine logs, ballast reports, and navigational data were reviewed thoroughly, confirming normal functioning and offering no mechanical explanation for the vessel's sudden disappearance. Crew training, operational protocols, and cargo management had followed standard procedure. Environmental readings were within expected ranges, and weather reports indicated no immediate storms or hazards. With all known factors accounted for, the disappearance defied conventional understanding. Investigators could only acknowledge that a vessel operating within normal parameters, transmitting a final SOS, had vanished entirely. The absence of physical evidence deepened the mystery and reinforced the notion that some maritime events resist explanation. The Sylvia L. Oser entered Bermuda Triangle records as another vessel lost after a brief SOS, a pattern of fleeting transmissions preceding complete vanishing that confounded maritime experts. Researchers compared the case to similar incidents involving large cargo ships, noting the uncanny similarities: brief distress, no survivors, and an absence of recoverable debris. Each addition to the Triangle's historical record reinforced the region's enigmatic reputation, though no theory provided definitive answers. The combination of oceanic scale, human action, and sudden disappearance created an intersection of factors that remained outside ordinary comprehension, leaving the ship's fate suspended between documented fact and unresolved mystery. The short distress call endures as the only human evidence of the ship's final moments, a fragile trace amid the unyielding expanse of ocean. Every operational detail, every log entry, and every observation from the crew now exists only in records and transmission fragments. The Atlantic swallowed the vessel entirely, leaving nothing to confirm the event except the fleeting SOS that reached the outside world. In this silence, the ship's disappearance stands as a stark reminder of the ocean's power to erase even the largest human creations, leaving mystery as the only certainty. The SS Sylvia L. Oser's last report echoes across archives and memory, an unresolved imprint swallowed by the Atlantic's silent vastness. The Piper PA-23's confused coordinates. The cockpit smelled faintly of oil and warm metal as sunlight scattered across the dashboard, the Atlantic stretching endlessly beyond the tiny aircraft. The pilot adjusted the seat slightly, hands brushing against worn controls, eyes flicking to the altimeter and compass. The sky above shifted in colour, a gradient from pale blue to near grey, while the ocean below glimmered in scattered reflections. Even in routine flight, a sense of exposure weighed on the pilot. Every gust of wind, every subtle vibration became magnified in the isolation of the cockpit. The vastness of the ocean pressed quietly, an indifferent presence beneath the small craft. Twin engines purred beneath the wings, gauges calibrated with care, while the compact fuselage bore the weight of fuel and equipment necessary for the long overwater flight. The PA-23, a light twin-engine aircraft, was designed for coastal flights and regional transport, yet this stretch over open water demanded constant vigilance. Instruments were checked repeatedly, switches toggled and rechecked, fuel flow monitored, and engine temperatures recorded at intervals. Even minor errors could cascade into serious issues, and the pilot knew that in the Atlantic, miles of empty water could transform any problem into an urgent crisis. Seated alone, the pilot's hands traced the flight charts, eyes moving constantly between dials, horizon and compass, balancing confidence against the solitude of open sky. Each instrument provided information, yet every reading required interpretation, particularly over featureless water where visual cues were limited. The pilot's training guided every action, but experience could only mitigate, not eliminate, the uncertainty inherent in long flights over the ocean. Mental focus was constant. Fatigue or distraction could result in misreadings. Even the steady hum of the engines demanded attention, its rhythm both reassuring and a reminder of the isolation surrounding the aircraft. Waves below glimmered intermittently as sunlight fractured through clouds, and subtle gusts buffeted the aircraft, challenging the pilot to maintain a steady altitude. The wind shifted suddenly, forcing minute corrections to the rudder and throttle, while thin layers of cloud above refracted sunlight into strange patterns. Occasionally the horizon seemed to tilt unnaturally, creating the illusion that the aircraft had drifted far off course. Small deviations became magnified over miles of open water, and the pilot's attention remained tightly focused on reconciling instrument readings with these visual cues. Each second demanded precision, as even minor errors could escalate into confusion. Periodic transmissions relayed altitude, heading and location to distant stations, their routine cadence a fragile reassurance against the isolation of the flight. The pilot's voice carried measured tones, repeating coordinates and flight information at intervals, each confirmed by ground personnel. These calls anchored the flight in a network of observation, though the Atlantic remained vast and largely indifferent. Listening to replies, the pilot noted slight delays and variations, recognizing them as routine, yet every hesitation reminded of the precarious nature of overwater flight. The small aircraft relied on these connections, the only human link across miles of empty ocean. Indicators flickered, compass needles quivered, and distant cloud formations seemed to drift contrary to the plane's expected course, unnerving even an experienced pilot. The horizon appeared inconsistent, a shifting line that refused to match instrument readings. Subtle misalignments suggested either mechanical error or an illusion imposed by environmental conditions. The pilot adjusted the trim and scanned instruments repeatedly, trying to locate any source of discrepancy. Anxiety grew quietly, threading through each check and adjustment. Over water, without visual reference points, even small errors could create a sense of being lost in a space that had no bounds. Throttle and trim adjustments were made with precision, eyes darting between instruments and horizon, tension building as small discrepancies refused to reconcile with charts. The pilot recalculated heading and altitude, cross-referencing flight plan notes with current position, yet the numbers refused to align. Minor course corrections were made, but each change seemed only to deepen the disorientation. Mental fatigue began to press as the mind tried to reconcile contradictory data, the horizon refusing to behave predictably. Despite confidence and training, the aircraft felt momentarily adrift, a small vessel of flesh and metal suspended in a vast, unknowable expanse. A hesitant, broken transmission emerged, coordinates mumbled, a single word of distress voiced with uncertainty, then silence swallowed the frequency entirely. The SOS carried no detail, only a fleeting signal that reached distant controllers and then evaporated. Air traffic control attempted repetition and clarification, but no response came. The brevity of the call suggested urgency, confusion, or sudden interference. For anyone listening, the signal was a haunting fragment, a human voice projecting concern across miles of ocean, leaving no trace of the aircraft's position, intentions, or eventual fate. The static that followed seemed heavier, as if absorbing the urgency of those last spoken words. Clouds thickened suddenly, light angles warped, and the ocean below appeared to move in patterns that contradicted all navigational calculations, heightening the pilot's disorientation. Shadows stretched unnaturally over the waves, while bright glimmers appeared in places they should not have, creating fleeting illusions of motion or presence. The sky seemed to tilt and curl, distorting perception. Compasses quivered erratically, and altimeters fluctuated in ways that defied logic. The pilot's mind raced to interpret conflicting data, struggling to distinguish between mechanical failure, environmental anomaly, or optical illusion. Each second felt drawn out. Time measured more by perception than by instruments. Time seemed to distort, minutes stretching into unmeasurable spans, as the pilot struggled to align instrument readings with visual references, each glance deepening uncertainty. Horizon lines bent unpredictably, and the wings appeared to float independently in a space that no longer matched charts. Mental strain compounded as every decision depended on unreliable cues. The pilot rotated knobs, recalibrated instruments, and sought familiar patterns, yet the ocean's immensity refused to provide reassurance. Reality itself felt tenuous, a delicate synthesis of observation, calculation, and instinct, each threatened by the unknowable forces that seemed to surround the aircraft. Static interrupted radios, fleeting reflections danced on the waves, and faint lights appeared at impossible angles, each phenomenon defying explanation, yet intensifying the tension. At times, the ocean appeared to ripple upward, creating illusions of vertical movement, while glints on the water suggested forms that could not exist. Radio signals cut in and out, making every attempt at external guidance impossible. The pilot's attention snapped between instruments, horizon, and these ephemeral cues, caught between certainty and hallucination. Every sensory input demanded interpretation, yet none could be fully trusted, leaving the small aircraft isolated in a space where normal rules seemed suspended. No confirmation of position or debris ever emerged, leaving only fragments of observation and a solitary interrupted SOS to mark the flight's final moments. Search and rescue attempts failed to locate wreckage or floating equipment. The Atlantic's vastness swallowed all evidence, preserving only the incomplete transmission and pilot reports as documentation. Without material traces, the event exists almost entirely as an unresolved signal, a whispered anomaly on flight records. Investigators could reconstruct only the framework of the flight, never the final trajectory, leaving the disappearance a silent mystery hovering over miles of open water. The PA-23's trajectory exists now as a series of unresolved impressions, instrument readings, fleeting glances, and one human voice swallowed by the Atlantic's vast and indifferent expanse. Records preserve the SOS and the scattered data points, yet the aircraft itself vanished entirely. The ocean's scale, combined with environmental and perceptual anomalies, renders any attempt at certainty impossible. What remains is the memory of the flight, a shadow of movement and sound recorded in logs, air traffic tapes, and human recollection, suspended between fact and the unknown. The aircraft became an echo, a question without resolution, a solitary presence dissolved into endless blue. The Piper. PA-23 vanished into the horizon, leaving only the faint haunting suggestion of coordinates that may have existed at all.